For 32 years, I was the invisible daughter, the one who got forgotten birthdays, the one who did all the heavy lifting, while my sister got pampered, the one who never quite belonged. So when my sister handed me a DNA test kit at my birthday party, laughing just to make sure you're actually one of us, I thought it was just another cruel joke. But 2 weeks later, everything I knew about my life shattered. The DNA results didn't match my parents'. Instead, they matched a name I'd only seen in old news articles Eleanor Kingsley, the billionaire heiress who vanished 30 years ago. The baby everyone thought was dead. Within hours, the FBI was at my door. Within days, I discovered my entire childhood was built on a lie, and the people responsible. They were closer than I ever imagined. This is the story of how a birthday joke uncovered a criminal conspiracy, a stolen identity, and a family's darkest secret. Stay until the end, because when I finally learned the truth, I made sure everyone involved paid the price they'd been running from for 3 decades. The invisible daughter was about to become impossible to ignore. My name is April Martinez. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a financial risk analyst for a mid-sized investment firm in Boston. On paper, my life looks successful. I have my own apartment in Cambridge, a respectable career, and the kind of independence most people work years to achieve. But none of that has ever been enough for my family. To them, I've always been the daughter who somehow fell short, no matter how hard I tried. I should have realised something was fundamentally wrong years ago. But when you grow up feeling like you're always on the outside looking in, you start to believe it's your fault. You start to think maybe you really aren't good enough, that there's something broken inside you that everyone else can see but you can't quite name. Take last Thanksgiving, for example. I arrived at my parents' house early, as I always do, carrying a homemade pumpkin pie and ready to help with preparations. My mother barely glanced at me when I walked through the door, too busy fussing over the flower arrangement my sister Lily had ordered from some expensive boutique florist. "Isn't this stunning?" Mum gushed, holding up a bouquet that probably cost more than my entire contribution to the meal. Lily has such exquisite taste. I spent the next 4 hours in the kitchen basting the turkey, mashing potatoes, and washing an endless stream of dishes, while Lily sat in the living room with our father scrolling through her phone and occasionally calling out requests for specific appetizers. When we finally sat down to eat, Dad raised his glass in a toast. "To Lily," he announced proudly, "who just got promoted to assistant manager at the boutique." Everyone clinked glasses enthusiastically. Lily beamed. I tried to catch my mother's eye across the table, hoping someone might remember that I'd received a significant promotion 3 months earlier, one that came with a 20% raise and a leadership role on a major project. But Mum was already reaching for the wine bottle, asking Lily about her dating life. This wasn't unusual. It was the pattern of my entire existence. My birthday in March is always the clearest evidence of how little I matter. I remember turning 30 because I spent it alone in my apartment, waiting for a phone call that never came. Lily's birthday, just 2 months later, was celebrated with a surprise party at an upscale restaurant complete with a custom cake and gifts that must have cost thousands of dollars. When I pointed out gently that my family had forgotten my 30th birthday entirely, my mother looked genuinely confused. "Oh, sweetie, you know we're not good with dates," she said dismissively. "Besides, you're so independent. We didn't think you'd mind." But I did mind. I minded desperately, even though I'd learned to hide it behind a professional smile and a calm demeanour that served me well in conference rooms, but left me hollow inside. The truth is, I've spent my entire adult life trying to prove I'm worthy of the same love and attention my family showers on Lily without a second thought. I bought my mother's birthday gift a full month in advance this year, a beautiful cashmere scarf in her favourite colour wrapped with care and presented on the exact day. She thanked me absently before turning her attention back to the photo album. Now, Lily had assembled a collection of family pictures that I noticed included very few photos of me. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was above needing their validation. But when my 32nd birthday arrived and 3 days passed without anyone in my family acknowledging it, something inside me finally cracked. I was sitting at my desk at work trying to focus on a risk assessment report when my phone buzzed with a text from Lily. "OMG, forgot your B-Day? Come over tonight, we'll celebrate." I should have known better than to hope. When I arrived at my parents' house that evening, there was no cake, no decorations, just leftover takeout containers on the kitchen counter, and my family gathered around the television. Lily jumped up when she saw me holding a small wrapped box with a grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Happy birthday, sis," she said, thrusting the box into my hands. "I got you something special." I opened it carefully, finding a DNA testing kit inside. The kind you send off to learn about your ancestry and genetic health markers. My family watched me with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to barely concealed amusement. Lily's smile widened into something sharp and mean. "Just to make sure you're actually one of us," she said with a laugh. "Let's see if you have some failure gene we don't know about." Everyone laughed. My father chuckled from his armchair. My mother smiled indulgently at Lily's wit, and even my aunt, who'd stopped by for coffee, joined in the amusement. I stood there holding the box, feeling heat rise to my cheeks, knowing that any reaction I showed would only make things worse. This was how it always went. Lily made me the punchline and everyone else played along because that's what we did in this family. I was the one who took the jokes, absorbed the dismissive comments and pretended not to care. I forced a smile and thanked her, slipping the kit into my purse and making an excuse about having to get home early for work the next day. No one tried to stop me. As I drove back to my Cambridge apartment that night, I told myself I'd throw the DNA kit in the trash the moment I got home. It was just another way for Lily to remind me that I didn't quite fit, that even my genetic makeup was probably disappointing somehow. But I didn't throw it away. The box sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days, taunting me every time I made coffee or unpacked groceries. The thing is, I've always been thorough to a fault. It's what makes me good at my job. I don't leave loose ends, I follow through on every detail, and I'm genuinely curious about data and patterns. By the 4th day, I found myself reading the instructions, thinking about ancestry and genetic markers, and all the interesting information these tests supposedly revealed. Maybe I'd discover I had some unexpected heritage, something that would explain why I'd always felt so different from my family. Maybe there was a logical scientific reason for why I'd never quite belonged. I completed the test on a Sunday afternoon, swabbing my cheek and sealing the sample in the prepaid envelope. As I dropped it in the mailbox outside my building, I felt ridiculous. This was exactly what Lily wanted for me to take her cruel joke seriously, to actually wonder if something was wrong with my DNA. But I'd already committed, and my analytical mind wanted to see the data, even if it was just to prove that genetics had nothing to do with why my family treated me like an afterthought. The company's website said results would take 2 to 3 weeks. I forgot about it almost immediately, diving into a complex project at work that required all my attention. We were assessing risk factors for a potential acquisition, and I spent long hours building financial models and analysing market trends. This was where I excelled, where my attention to detail and thoroughness were valued rather than mocked. My colleagues respected my work. My boss had just assigned me to lead the due diligence team. In my professional life, I wasn't invisible at all. Exactly 2 weeks later, I was eating cereal at my kitchen table before work when an email notification appeared on my phone. The subject line read, "Your DNA results are ready. Action required." I clicked through, expecting to find some colourful pie charts showing my ethnic background and maybe some information about genetic health markers. Instead, I found myself staring at a message I'd never seen in any of the Ancestry Service reviews I'd read while researching these tests. Additional verification required. Please contact customer service immediately. A strange unease settled in my stomach. I clicked through to my account, and that's when everything I thought I knew about my life began to unravel. The screen showed partial results, but instead of the neat ancestral breakdown, I'd anticipated, there was a stark clinical message that made my hands go cold. Alert, genetic match flagged for law enforcement review. Your DNA profile has been matched to an active missing persons database. Match confidence, 99.8%. Related individual, Eleanor Kingsley DOB, December 1992, reported missing June 1994. I read the words 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding. Eleanor Kingsley. I knew that name. Everyone in New England knew that name. It was one of those tragic cases that got rehashed in true crime documentaries and newspaper anniversary articles. The baby heiress who vanished from her wealthy family's estate 30 years ago and was never found. The case that went cold despite the family's money and connections. The mystery that had haunted Massachusetts for 3 decades. But that couldn't have anything to do with me. It made no sense. I scrolled down, my heart hammering now, and found more information that seemed to come from some kind of official database rather than the Ancestry Service's usual cheerful interface. Parent-child match Marianne Kingsley. Probability 99.8%. Below that, in what looked like an automated comparison, was another line that made my vision blur. Genetic relationship to registered parents, Robert Martinez, Linda Martinez, 0% match, no biological connection detected. My phone slipped from my hands and clattered onto the table. I stared at the screen, barely breathing, trying to process what I was seeing. This had to be a mistake. Some kind of database error or contamination at the lab. But even as I thought it, my analytical mind was already rejecting that explanation. DNA testing was sophisticated. The chances of a false match at 99.8% probability were virtually impossible. And the fact that I showed 0 genetic relationship to my parents that couldn't be explained away by lab error either. I picked up my phone with shaking hands and opened the full email. The message was longer than the initial notification written in formal, almost legal language. Dear customer, your DNA sample has been flagged due to a match with profiles in the National Missing Persons Database. Under federal law, we are required to report such matches to the appropriate authorities. The FBI has been notified and will be contacting you directly. Please do not attempt to contact family members or discuss this matter until you have spoken with federal investigators. This is for your safety and the integrity of an ongoing investigation. I sat frozen at my kitchen table, my cereal turning soggy in the bowl, staring at words that seemed to belong to someone else's life. The FBI, missing persons, Eleanor Kingsley. None of this could be real. I was April Martinez, born and raised in a modest middle-class home in Medford, Massachusetts. I had baby pictures, a birth certificate, childhood memories. I wasn't some missing heiress from a billionaire family. But as I sat there, fragments of my life began clicking into place in a way that made my chest tighten with something that felt like panic mixed with a strange, terrible clarity. The way my parents had always treated me differently, the absence of early childhood photos, the vague, contradictory stories about my birth, my mother's strange reluctance to ever discuss my baby years. The fact that I'd never seen my birth certificate always told it was somewhere in storage. My phone rang at exactly 6 o'clock the next morning, jarring me awake from a restless sleep where I dreamed of locked rooms and missing pieces. I grabbed it from my nightstand, my heart already racing before I even saw the screen. The caller ID displayed a number I didn't recognize, but below it, in clear letters, were words that confirmed this nightmare was real. FBI, Crimes Against Children Division. I answered on the 4th ring, my voice coming out hoarse and uncertain. Hello, Miss Martinez. This is Special Agent Caroline Webb with the FBI's Crimes Against Children Division. I'm calling regarding the DNA results you received yesterday. I know this must be overwhelming, but I need you to understand that you're safe and we're here to help you. Her voice was professional but surprisingly gentle, as though she'd had training in how to speak to people whose entire lives had just imploded. Are you able to talk right now, or would you prefer we come to you? I sat up in bed, pulling my knees to my chest. Come to me? You mean like to my apartment? The surreality of the situation hadn't diminished with daylight. If anything, it felt more impossible now, with morning traffic sounds filtering through my windows and the ordinary world continuing as though nothing had changed. Yes, ma'am. We have significant information to share with you, and this isn't a conversation we should have over the phone. Would 10 o'clock this morning work for you? We can come to your home, or, if you'd prefer, we can meet at our Boston field office. I looked around my small apartment, the place that had always felt like my sanctuary, the first space that was truly mine, and realised I didn't want federal agents seeing how I lived, cataloguing my belongings, judging the life I'd built. The field office, I heard myself say. I'll come there. Agent Webb gave me an address in Chelsea and told me to bring identification. And Ms. Martinez, please don't contact your family yet. I know that's difficult, but it's important for both your safety and the integrity of our investigation. I arrived at the FBI field office 40 minutes early, too anxious to wait at home. A receptionist directed me to a conference room on the 3rd floor, where I sat alone for 15 minutes, studying the generic landscape paintings on the walls and trying to steady my breathing. When the door finally opened, 2 agents entered, both carrying thick file folders and wearing expressions that seemed carefully calibrated to put me at ease. Agent Webb was a woman in her mid-40s, with kind eyes and greying hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her partner, Agent Marcus Chen, was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, with an intensity that suggested he took his work very seriously. They sat across from me at the conference table, and Agent Webb slid a box of tissues within my reach before either of them spoke. Ms. Martinez, first, I want you to know that you're not in any trouble, Agent Webb began. You're a potential victim in a case that's been open for 30 years. Everything we discuss today is about helping you understand what may have happened to you and ensuring your safety going forward. She paused, studying my face. Can you tell me what you know about Eleanor Kingsley? I swallowed hard. Just what everyone knows? She was a baby who disappeared in 1994. Her family was wealthy. The case never got solved. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and clinical, as though I were discussing someone else's tragedy. Agent Chen opened his file and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the table. It showed a baby girl, perhaps 18 months old, with dark curly hair and a bright smile. She was sitting on a woman's lap, reaching for the camera. This is Eleanor Victoria Kingsley, taken approximately 2 weeks before she disappeared on June 15, 1994. She was taken from her family's estate in Newport, Rhode Island, during her 18-month birthday celebration. There were over 40 guests present, including family members, staff, and business associates. I stared at the photo, looking for something familiar, some recognition of this child who might be me. But she was just a baby, generic in the way all babies are, with features too undeveloped to offer any real comparison to my adult face. The Kingsley family owns and operates a chain of luxury hotels throughout the Northeast, Agent Webb continued. At the time of Eleanor's disappearance, they were one of the wealthiest families in New England. They paid a ransom of $500,000 to a designated drop location following the kidnapper's instructions exactly. But Eleanor was never returned. Agent Chen pulled out more documents, spreading them across the table like evidence in a trial. The investigation was extensive initially. We had FBI involvement from day one, given that a kidnapping had crossed state lines. The ransom drop was in Connecticut. But despite all our resources, despite the family's money and connections, and their willingness to cooperate fully, the case went cold within a year. No viable suspects, no credible leads, no trace of Eleanor Kingsley. He looked at me directly, until your DNA showed up in that ancestry database 2 days ago. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but refused to let them fall. But I have parents. I have a birth certificate. I have memories of my childhood, of growing up in Medford. How is any of this possible? That's what we're trying to determine, Agent Webb said softly, which is why we need your help, and why we need to collect additional DNA samples under proper legal protocols. The sample you sent to the Ancestry Company is valuable But for prosecution purposes, we need samples collected with proper chain of custody documentation. They explained the process, treating me with a reverence that made me uncomfortable. I wasn't some valuable witness who needed to be handled with care. I was just April Martinez, the overlooked daughter, the invisible woman who'd spent her whole life feeling inadequate. But they spoke to me as though I mattered, as though my cooperation was crucial, and they kept using phrases like victims' rights and your legal protections that made the situation feel even more surreal. Agent Chen swabbed the inside of my cheek with methodical precision, sealing each sample in separate evidence bags and documenting every step. While he worked, Agent Webb continued talking, her voice steady and informative. Under the Crime Victims' Rights Act, you have the right to be informed about the investigation, to be treated with dignity and respect, and to be protected from the accused. We're going to do everything we can to find out what happened to you. Can I ask you some questions about your family? Agent Chen said once he'd finished with the samples. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and a pen. The people you know as your parents, Robert and Linda Martinez. What can you tell us about them? I told them everything I could think of, though it felt like a betrayal even as I spoke. My father worked in building maintenance. My mother was a part-time bookkeeper. We'd lived in the same modest house in Medford my entire life. They'd always said I was born at Melrose Wakefield Hospital, though I'd never actually seen my birth certificate. They rarely talked about my early childhood, always changing the subject when I asked about baby photos or stories from when I was very young. Agent Webb's pen moved steadily across her notepad. And do your parents have any connection to the Boston-Newport area in the early 1990s? Did either of them work in hospitality or have any association with hotels? I started to shake my head, then stopped. A memory surfaced, fuzzy and half forgotten. My father, he worked at a hotel once, I think, before I was born. I remember him mentioning it once when we drove past some fancy place in Boston, but he didn't talk about it much. The two agents exchanged a look that made my stomach drop. Which hotel? Agent Chen asked carefully. I don't remember. I was maybe 10 when he mentioned it. It was just a passing comment. That evening, I sat on my apartment floor, surrounded by old photo albums I dug out of my storage closet. I told the FBI agents I needed time to process everything before they contacted my parents, and they'd agreed to give me 24 hours. But I couldn't stop thinking about Agent Webb's question, about hotels, about my father's vague past, about all the gaps in my early history that I'd never questioned, because children don't question the narrative they're given. I flipped through pictures of birthday parties and school events looking for something I couldn't name, and then I found it stuck in the back of an album from the early 90s, a photo of my father as a younger man, probably in his late 20s, standing outside a building with a proud smile. He was wearing a dark uniform with brass buttons, and behind him, crystal clear in the photograph, was an ornate sign, the Kingsley Newport Grand Hotel. I sat on my apartment floor holding that photograph until my hands went numb. The image of my father in his Kingsley Hotel uniform felt like a smoking gun, though I couldn't fully articulate what crime it proved. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe lots of people had worked at Kingsley hotels over the years. Maybe I was seeing connections that didn't exist because my mind was desperate to make sense of the impossible. But I knew better. I'd spent my entire career analysing data and identifying patterns, calculating the probability of various outcomes. The odds of this being random chance were astronomical. My father had worked at the exact hotel where Eleanor Kingsley lived. Eleanor disappeared in June 1994. And somehow I'd ended up as his daughter shortly thereafter, with no clear explanation of where I'd actually come from. I needed answers, and I had less than 24 hours before the FBI made this official. If my parents had something to hide, I wanted to hear it from them first, before federal agents showed up at their door with arrest warrants. Maybe there was an explanation I hadn't considered. Maybe they'd adopted me legally and simply hadn't known about my background. Maybe they were victims in this too. I drove to my childhood home in Medford the next morning, my stomach churning with anxiety. The house looked exactly as it always had, a modest 2-story colonial with peeling paint and an overgrown garden my mother never had time to maintain properly. I'd grown up here, played in that yard, learned to ride a bike on this sidewalk. Every corner held memories, and now all of them felt contaminated by uncertainty. My mother answered the door with flour on her hands, clearly in the middle of baking something. "April, sweetie, what a surprise. I wasn't expecting you today." Her smile was warm but distracted already, turning back toward the kitchen. "I'm making cinnamon rolls for the church bake sale. Come, help me, would you?" I followed her inside, my throat tight. "Mom, I need to ask you some questions about when you adopted me." Her hand stilled over the mixing bowl. She didn't turn around. "What brought this on?" I just realized I don't actually know much about it. Where exactly did I come from? I kept my voice casual, trying not to spook her, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "We've told you this before, honey. You were from a children's home in Texas. We went through an agency, did all the proper paperwork." She started stirring again too vigorously, flour puffing up in little clouds. "Which agency?" I pressed. "And why Texas? That seems like a long way to go for an adoption." "I don't remember all the details, April. It was over 30 years ago." Her voice had an edge, now defensive and sharp. "Why does this matter now?" I pulled out my phone and showed her a photo I'd taken of some old paperwork I'd found in the back of my closet documents I'd never really examined before. "Because this says Private Adoption Arizona, not Texas, not through an agency." My mother's face went pale. She set down her spoon, carefully wiped her hands on her apron, and reached for the teacup sitting on the counter. "You must be misremembering what we told you." "Did Dad ever work at a hotel?" I asked, changing tactics. "In Newport, maybe, in the early 90s? The teacup slipped from her fingers and shattered on the tile floor, ceramic shards scattering across the kitchen. My mother stared at the broken pieces, her whole body trembling. "Who told you that? Who have you been talking to? Mom, what's going on? Why are you reacting like this?" I moved toward her, but she stepped on back, nearly stumbling over the broken china. Nothing is going on. Your father worked lots of places when he was younger. I don't keep track of every job he had before we got married." But her eyes were wild, now frightened in a way I'd never seen before. "Mom, I need you to tell me the truth. Please, did you know a family named Kingsley?" She actually gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. For a long moment she just stared at me, and I watched something crumble behind her eyes, some carefully maintained wall finally giving way. "April, you need to stop asking these questions. You need to stop digging into the past. Please, I'm begging you." "Why, what are you so afraid of?" She sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly looking much older than her 60 years. Where is this coming from? Did someone contact you? Did something happen?" I sat across from her, my heart pounding. "I took a DNA test, and it came back with some unexpected results." "Oh God." She pressed her hands to her face. "Oh God, no, this can't be happening." "Mom, tell me the truth. Am I adopted? Where did I really come from?" But she was already standing, shaking her head frantically. I can't talk about this. You need to let it go, April. For your own safety, you need to stop looking into this right now." I left without getting any real answers, my mother's panic only confirming my worst fears. As I walked to my car, I noticed Miss Chen from next door, watering her garden. She'd lived on this street since before I was born, one of those neighbourhood fixtures who knew everyone's business. "Mrs. Chen," I called out impulsively, "can I ask you something about when I was a baby?" She smiled, setting down her hose. "Of course, dear. What would you like to know?" "Do you remember when my parents brought me home? What was that like?" Her smile faded slightly, and she glanced toward my parents' house. "Well, it was quite sudden, actually. Your mother wasn't pregnant. I would have noticed we saw each other almost every day back then. But one morning, there was a baby. You. They said they'd adopted you, but it seemed very quick. We all thought it was a bit strange, to be honest, but we minded our business. Different times back then. That afternoon, I returned to my childhood home while my parents were out. I still had a key, and I told myself I wasn't really breaking in. This was my family home, and I had a right to look for answers. I headed straight for the garage, where my father stored boxes of old papers and memorabilia that he'd never bothered to organise or throw away. It took me an hour of searching through dusty cardboard boxes before I found a shoebox tucked behind old tax returns and Christmas decorations. Inside were newspaper clippings all yellowed with age, all about the same story: Kingsley heiress vanished, baby Eleanor still missing, family offers reward. And on every single article, someone had used a thick black marker to scribble out the name Kingsley, as though trying to erase it from existence. I recognised my father's handwriting in the margins, note states, reminders. I was still sitting on the garage floor, surrounded by evidence of my parents' deception, when I heard the side door open. My mother stood there backlit by the afternoon sun, and when she saw what I was holding, the last of her defences crumbled. "April," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, stop looking. There are people who won't want you alive if you keep digging." I stared at my mother at the terror in her eyes that seemed directed not at me, but at something beyond both of us, something she'd been running from for 30 years. "Who, Mum? Who doesn't want me alive? What did you and Dad do?" But she was already backing away, shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. I can't tell you. Just please, April, stop asking questions. Go back to your life. Forget you ever took that test." She turned and fled back into the house, leaving me alone with the evidence of her guilt scattered across the garage floor. I gathered every clipping, every document, and took photos of all of it with my phone before carefully placing everything back in the shoebox, exactly as I'd found it. My hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, that professional composure I'd cultivated over years of high-stakes business meetings, serving me well, even now. Then I drove back to my apartment and called Agent Webb. She answered on the first ring. "Miss Martinez, we were just about to call you." "I need to come in," I said. "I found something." And my mother basically admitted they've been lying to me my entire life. 2 hours later, I was back in the same FBI conference room, watching Agent Webb and Agent Chen examine the photos I'd taken. Their expressions grew grimmer with each image. "This is significant," Agent Chen said finally. "This shows premeditation, ongoing knowledge of the crime, deliberate concealment. This isn't someone who unknowingly adopted a child through questionable channels. This is someone who knew exactly who you were and chose to hide it." Agent Webb's phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen before looking up at me with something like sympathy. "The lab results just came through on your new DNA samples. It's official. You are Eleanor Victoria Kingsley. 99.9% certainty. There's no doubt anymore, April. You're the missing heiress everyone has been searching for since 1994. The words hung in the air between us, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. I wasn't April Martinez anymore. Or maybe I was, but I was also Eleanor Kingsley, and those two identities were going to have to somehow coexist in the same body, the same life. I'd spent 32 years being one person, and now I had to reconcile that with the person I should have been. What happens now? My voice came out smaller than I intended. Now this becomes an active federal kidnapping investigation, Agent Chen said. There's no statute of limitations on kidnapping. Everyone involved in taking you in, hiding you in, keeping you from your family, they're all going to face federal charges. My phone rang before I could process that. I looked down at the screen, expecting it to be my mother, or father trying to explain, trying to beg me to stay quiet. Instead, the caller ID showed a number with a Rhode Island area code and a name, Whitmore and Associates Legal. Agent Webb nodded. "You should answer that." The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, belonging to someone who was clearly accustomed to handling sensitive matters with discretion. "Ms. Martinez, or should I say Ms. Kingsley? My name is James Whitmore. I represent the Kingsley family estate. The FBI has informed us that your identity has been confirmed, and Mrs. Marianne Kingsley is desperately hoping to meet with you as soon as possible. She's waited 30 years for this moment. My biological mother, a woman I'd never met, never even thought about until a few days ago because I'd believed the people who raised me were my real parents. I don't know," I managed. "This is all happening so fast." "I understand completely," Miss Whitmore said, his voice gentling, "but I want you to know that Mrs. Kingsley has never stopped looking for you. She's never given up hope, and she needs to see with her own eyes that you're alive and well. Would you be willing to meet with her? We can arrange everything, transportation, accommodations, anything you need. We just ask that you come to Newport within the next 48 hours, if at all possible." After I hung up, having agreed to a meeting 2 days from now, Agent Webb pulled up something on her laptop and turned the screen toward me. "Before you meet your biological family, there's something you should see. This is from the original case file." The screen showed a series of photographs of baby Eleanor professional portraits taken just weeks before the kidnapping. In one of them, the photographer had captured her in profile, and there clearly visible behind her right ear was a distinctive heart-shaped birthmark. Exactly like the one I'd always had, the one Lily used to tease me about when we were children, calling it my defect mark. I reached up and touched the spot behind my own ear, feeling the slightly raised skin I'd carried my entire life without ever questioning where it came from. "That's me," I whispered. "That's really me." Agent Chen's expression was grave. "There's something else you need to know. In 1994, we had 3 primary suspects in Eleanor's disappearance. 2 of them are now deceased, but the 3rd is still alive, and if they discover your identity has been confirmed, you could be in serious danger." I felt cold all over. "Who are they?" Agent Webb leaned forward, her voice dropping. "That's what we need to determine. But April, I have to ask you directly. One of the original suspects from 1994, based on evidence and witness statements we gathered back then, is someone in your adoptive family. We need to know if you're safe at home or if we need to take measures to protect you right now." "I'm not going back there," I said immediately, my voice firmer than I felt. "Not to their house. Not until I know what they did." The thought of sitting across the dinner table from people who might have stolen me from my real family, who'd let me grow up feeling unloved and inadequate, while knowing the entire time that I belonged somewhere else, it made my stomach turn. Agent Webb nodded, seeming to expect this answer. "We can arrange for you to stay in a secure location until we have more answers. But first, I think you need to see the full case file. Under the Crime Victims' Rights Act, you have the legal right to review evidence pertaining to crimes committed against you. This was your life, April. You deserve to know what happened." Agent Chen left the room and returned with the 2 thick accordion folders, the kind that hold decades of investigation materials. He set them on the conference table in front of me with a heavy thud. "This is everything we have on the Eleanor Kingsley kidnapping. It's a lot to process, and some of it is difficult to read. Take your time. We'll be right outside if you need anything." After they left, I sat alone with the files for a long moment before opening them. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled out the first document, a detailed incident report dated June 15, 1994. The very professional clinical language couldn't disguise the horror of what it described. Eleanor Victoria Kingsley had disappeared from her family's Newport estate during her 18th month birthday party. According to the report, over 40 guests had been present, family members, business associates. household staff, and friends of the family. The party had been held in the estate's expansive gardens, with a catering company providing food and entertainment. At approximately 4:30 p.m, the nanny, a woman named Patricia Alden, had taken Eleanor upstairs for a scheduled nap. When Mrs. Kingsley went to check on her daughter an hour later, both the nanny and Eleanor were gone. The investigation notes painted a picture of immediate chaos. The estate had been searched within minutes, guests were questioned, and local police were called. By 6 p.m, when it became clear that Eleanor had been taken, the FBI was brought in. A ransom note was discovered in the nursery at 7:15 p.m, demanding $500,000 in unmarked bills and providing detailed instructions for the drop-off location. What chilled me as I read further was how much the kidnapper had known about the family's private life. The ransom note referenced details that only someone with inside access would know the security code for the private wing of the house Miss Kingsley's scheduled for the following week, even the combination to a safe in Mr. Kingsley's study that contained emergency cash. The FBI's analysis concluded that this was either an inside job or someone had been conducting surveillance for months. The family had paid the ransom exactly as instructed, dropping the money at a rest stop off I-95 in Connecticut. But Eleanor had never been returned. The money disappeared, and so did any trace of the baby. I flipped through witness statements, each one painting a picture of a sophisticated operation. Several guests reported seeing an unfamiliar man in maintenance clothes near the service entrance around the time of the disappearance, but descriptions were vague and contradictory. One statement from a catering worker mentioned seeing the nanny Patricia Alden talking intensely with a man in a hotel uniform near the delivery entrance about an hour before Eleanor was taken. Patricia Alden had vanished along with Eleanor and was never found. Her background check, which I found several pages later, showed she'd been hired only 3 months before the kidnapping through an agency that later turned out to have falsified her references. She'd essentially been a plant, someone inserted into the household for the specific purpose of taking Eleanor. The primary suspect in the FBI's investigation was a man named Thomas Chen, a security guard who'd been fired from the Kingsley Hotel 6 months before the kidnapping for suspicious behaviour and poor performance. Chen had been seen in the area on the day of the party, and a search of his apartment had revealed detailed floor plans of the Kingsley estate that he had no legitimate reason to possess. But the evidence was largely circumstantial. Chen had an alibi for part of the afternoon he'd been at a bar in Providence, and there was nothing concrete tying him to the actual abduction. Then, in March 1995, just 8 months after Eleanor's disappearance, Thomas Chen had died in what was officially ruled a single-car accident on a rural road in Connecticut. The investigating officer's report noted that Chen's vehicle had gone off the road at high speed, hitting a tree. No other vehicles were involved. Toxicology showed he'd been drinking, though not heavily. The case file included a note from an FBI agent expressing doubt about the accident, suggesting it was too convenient, given that Chen had been their primary suspect, but no evidence of foul play was ever established. I pulled out the surveillance footage stills that had been collected from various cameras around the estate. Most were grainy and unclear, but one image made me freeze. It showed a man in dark clothing carrying what appeared to be a small bundle wrapped in a blanket, walking quickly toward the service gate at the edge of the property. The timestamp read 5:47 p.m, exactly during the window when Eleanor had been taken. The image quality was poor, taken from a distance, and partially obscured by trees, but something about the man's build, his posture, the way he carried himself, sent a shock of recognition through me. I'd seen that posture 1,000 times, in the way he walked to his truck in the morning, in the way he carried heavy boxes during family moves, in the slope of his shoulders when he was tired. The man in the photo looked exactly like my adoptive father would have looked 30 years ago. I was still staring at that image when I noticed a handwritten note in the margin of the page written in what looked like a detective scrawl. Case closed abruptly. Chief ordered stop investigation. No explanation given. Something wrong here? I showed Agent Webb the surveillance photo, and the note about the investigation being shut down. She studied both for a long moment before meeting my eyes. We've always suspected there was interference in the original investigation. Someone with influence wanted this case to go away. And now, looking at this photo with fresh eyes, knowing what we know about your adoptive father's employment history at the Kingsley Hotel, it's enough for us to bring him in for formal questioning. Not yet, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. Give me one more chance to talk to them first. Before lawyers get involved and everything becomes official statements, I need to hear them admit it to my face. Against Agent Webb's better judgment, she agreed to let me return to my adoptive parents' house the next morning, with agents stationed nearby in case I needed help. I didn't sleep that night, lying awake in the hotel room the FBI had arranged, thinking about the 32 years of lies and the little girl I should have been. When I arrived at the house in Medford the next morning, my father's truck was in the driveway. I let myself in through the front door and found my entire adoptive family gathered in the living room, as though they'd been waiting for me. My mother sat on the couch looking like she'd aged a decade overnight. My father stood by the window, his face drawn and grey, and Lily paced back and forth like a caged animal, her expression a mixture of fear and fury. There she is, Lily spat before I could even close the door behind me. The prodigal daughter returns, or should I say the Kingsley princess? Is that what you want us to call you now? Lily, that's enough, my father said quietly, but she ignored him. You're doing this for the money, aren't you? All these years you acted like you were so above everything, so independent and successful, and now you get to waltz off to your billionaire family while we're left with nothing. Her voice cracked with something that sounded almost like desperation. Do you have any idea what this is going to do to us, to our lives? I stared at her, seeing clearly for the first time that her cruelty had always come from a place of insecurity, from knowing something was fundamentally wrong in our family, even if she couldn't name it. This isn't about money, Lily. This is about the fact that I was stolen from my real family, that someone took me from people who loved me and wanted me. We loved you, my mother whispered, but the words sounded hollow. Did you? I turned to her. Because I spent my entire childhood feeling like I didn't belong, like there was something wrong with me that made me unlovable. And now I know why. You couldn't love me fully because every time you looked at me, you saw your crime. My father finally spoke, his voice rough. April, please, don't go to Newport. Don't meet with those people. We can explain everything. We can make you understand. Then explain it now, I demanded. Tell me the truth, all of it. But he just shook his head, and I realised they were never going to voluntarily confess. They'd rather beg and manipulate and make vague promises than actually tell me what they'd done. So I walked past all of them out through the kitchen and back to the garage, where I'd found the newspaper clippings. This time, I knew exactly what I was looking for. The box was still there, and I pulled it down from the shelf with shaking hands. But now, I dug deeper, moving aside the clippings, until I found a second smaller box underneath. Inside was a collection of items that made my breath catch, a hospital bracelet too small for an adult-sized for an infant with baby girl Kingsley printed on it. A tiny pink sweater with delicate embroidery, exactly like the one I'd seen in the photos from Eleanor's case file. And a silver baby bracelet engraved with a single name, Victoria. Eleanor Victoria Kingsley, my real name. My mother had followed me to the garage. She stood in the doorway, watching me discover each item, tears streaming silently down her face. But she didn't try to stop me. At the bottom of the box beneath the baby things, I found an envelope thick and heavy. I opened it and found myself staring at stacks of old bills, carefully preserved, the paper slightly yellowed with age. $50,000 in 20s, 50s, and hundreds, all from 1994. I pulled out one of the bills and held it up to the light, studying the serial number. The FBI had shown me the ransom money specifications in the case file. These bills were from the right year, the right denominations, and I was willing to bet if someone checked those serial numbers against the records, they'd find a match. Why? I asked, my voice breaking. Why did you keep this? Why not spend it? Hide it, get rid of it. Why keep evidence of what you did? My mother's voice was barely audible. We were afraid to spend it, afraid someone would trace it back to us, and we couldn't throw it away because... She stopped pressing her hand to her mouth. Because what? Because it was proof you were real, that you came from somewhere, that we didn't just dream you. She sank against the doorframe. Robert wanted to burn it all, destroy everything, but I couldn't. I kept it hidden, kept all of it, because someday I thought you might need to know the truth. I stood there, holding $50,000 in ransom money, 30 years old, never spent, carefully preserved like some kind of terrible keepsake. My hands were shaking so badly, the bills rustled. This is blood money. This came from a family whose baby was stolen, from people who would have given everything to get their daughter back. I looked at my mother, this woman who'd raised me but never quite loved me the way a mother should. Why did you keep blood money for 30 years? She opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, my father appeared behind her, his face white as paper. Because if we ever got caught, we wanted proof we weren't the ones who took you. My father's words hung in the air, like an admission and a defense all at once. What does that mean? I demanded. You're saying you didn't kidnap me, but you kept evidence that someone else did. You knew where I came from and you kept me anyway. He wouldn't meet my eyes. It's not that simple, April. You have to understand. No. I cut him off, my voice harder than I'd ever heard it. I don't have to understand anything. You had 32 years to tell me the truth, and you chose to let me grow up thinking I was worthless, thinking there was something wrong with me that made my own family unable to love me properly. I left before they could say anything else, taking the box of evidence with me. Agent Webb was waiting in an unmarked car 2 blocks away, and when she saw my face, she didn't ask questions. She just drove me back to the hotel and told me to take the time I needed. Alone in that sterile hotel room, I finally allowed myself to fall apart. I sat on the bed and cried for the little girl I'd been, the one who tried so hard to earn love that should have been freely given. I cried for the parents I thought I had, who turned out to be strangers with secrets. And I cried for Eleanor Kingsley, the baby who'd been stolen from a family that actually wanted her. When the tears finally stopped, I opened my laptop and pulled up my digital journal, the place where I'd been recording my thoughts and feelings since college, a habit my therapist had recommended during a particularly difficult semester. I needed to make sense of this to organise my thoughts the way I organise data at work, to find the pattern that would help me understand. I started typing. I spent 30 years trying to prove I deserved to be loved. I worked harder, achieved more, stayed quieter, demanded less. I made myself small and unobtrusive, hoping that if I was good enough, accomplished enough, invisible enough, they might finally see me as worthy. But now I understand. I always deserved it. They just couldn't see it through their guilt. Every time they looked at me, they saw their crime. And so they kept me at arm's length, gave their love to Lily, who was truly theirs, and made me feel like I was fundamentally flawed. But the flaw was never in me. It was in them. The words poured out, and with them came a clarity I hadn't felt in days. My entire childhood suddenly made sense in a way it never had before. The favouritism, the distance, the inability to celebrate my achievements, none of it had been about me. It had all been about their guilt, their fear, their knowledge that loving me fully meant acknowledging what they'd done. They had created a mental prison for all of us, and I'd been the one paying the price. I thought about the choice in front of me. I could walk away from this entire situation, tell the FBI I didn't want to press charges, refuse to meet the Kingsleys and go back to being April Martinez. My adoptive parents would be spared prosecution, Lily would keep the only family structure she'd ever known, and I would spend the rest of my life living a lie, protecting people who'd stolen my identity and my birthright. Or I could pursue the truth, meet my biological mother, learn who Eleanor Kingsley was supposed to be. But that path meant destroying the only family I'd ever known, watching my adoptive parents face federal charges, and stepping into a world of wealth and privilege that felt as foreign to me as a distant planet. The Kingsley attorney, Mr. Whitmore, had called 3 more times that day, each message more urgent than the last. "Mrs. Kingsley is desperate to see you," he'd said in the most recent voicemail. "She's waited 30 years. Please don't make her wait any longer." And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about me anymore. There was another victim in this story, a mother who'd spent 3 decades not knowing if her daughter was alive or dead, who'd probably blamed herself every day for not protecting her child, who'd lived with a grief I couldn't begin to imagine. Marianne Kingsley had the right to know her daughter had survived. She had the right to hold me to see that I was okay, to have some kind of closure after 30 years of not knowing. I had the right to know my own story, not the sanitized version my adoptive parents had fed me, not the carefully constructed lie that had defined my entire existence, but the real, messy, complicated truth. No one else had the right to decide what I could handle, what I deserved to know, or which identity I was allowed to claim. I picked up my phone and called Mr. Whitmore back. "I'll be there tomorrow," I told him. "I want to meet Mrs. Kingsley. I want to know who I really am." After I hung up, I felt something shift inside me, a sense of agency I hadn't felt since this entire nightmare began. I wasn't just a victim anymore, passively watching, as the FBI and lawyers and my adoptive family made decisions about my life. I was taking control of my own story, even if I didn't know where it would lead. I was still processing this new resolve when my phone rang again. Agent Webb's name appeared on the screen, and something about the late hour, nearly 10 p.m, made my stomach drop even before I answered. "April, I'm sorry to call so late, but we've just uncovered something in the old case files that changes things significantly." Her voice was tight with urgency. "Can you come back to the office right now? This can't wait until morning." "What is it? What did you find?" There was a pause, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. "We've been cross-referencing Eleanor's case with other unsolved missing persons cases from the same time period, looking for patterns. And we found one. April, there was a second victim in 1992, 2 years before you were taken. Another baby girl who disappeared under similar circumstances. We need to talk about this immediately." 20 minutes later, I was back in the FBI building, being led through empty corridors to Agent Webb's office rather than the conference room we'd used before. The urgency in her voice had scared me, made me imagine terrible scenarios. Other victims, a serial kidnapper, some dark network of child trafficking that I'd somehow escaped. But when I walked into her office, Agent Chen was there with financial documents spread across every available surface, and I realised this wasn't about another victim at all. It was about money. "I apologise for the confusion on the phone," Agent Webb said, immediately seeing my expression. "I misspoke in my urgency. There's no second victim. But what we've found is potentially even more significant to your case." She gestured to a chair, and I sank into it, relief and confusion warring inside me. Agent Chen pulled up a document on his laptop and turned the screen toward me. "We've been digging into the Kingsley family finances from 1994, and we've discovered something that changes our understanding of motive. This wasn't a random kidnapping by an opportunistic criminal. This was calculated, deliberate, and it was about inheritance." He showed me a family tree of the Kingsleys with dates and financial notations beside each name. In early 1994, Eleanor's grandfather, William Kingsley, was 83 years old and in declining health. He was the patriarch who'd built the hotel empire, and he controlled the family trust, approximately $60 million at the time, plus majority shares in Kingsley Hotels Corporation. Agent Webb took over, pointing to different branches of the family tree. William had 3 children: Charles Eleanor's father, Margaret, who died in 1989, and Daniel, the youngest, who was 32 in 1994. The will William had, at the time, split the estate primarily between Charles and Daniel, with smaller portions to grandchildren. But in March of 1994, William announced he was updating his will to include provisions for all grandchildren equally. Eleanor was one of those grandchildren, I said, slowly beginning to understand. Exactly. With Eleanor alive, the estate would be divided among more heirs. William was specific about wanting to ensure all his grandchildren were provided for. He'd seen too many wealthy families torn apart by inheritance fights. But if Eleanor disappeared before the new will was executed... Agent Chen pulled up another document. The division would revert to fewer beneficiaries. I stared at the family tree at the name Daniel Kingsley, trying to process what they were telling me. You think someone in the family kidnapped me, one of my own relatives? We think it's a strong possibility, Agent Webb said carefully, particularly when you look at Daniel Kingsley's financial situation in 1994. She showed me bank statements and business records that painted a picture of desperation. Daniel had invested heavily in several business ventures in the late 80s and early 90s. A restaurant chain, some real estate developments, a tech startup. All of them failed. By 1994, he was drowning in debt. We're talking about nearly $3 million in the red, with creditors circling. Agent Chen pulled up more documents. Without a substantial inheritance, Daniel would have lost everything. His home, his lifestyle, his position in the family. He needed money desperately, and he needed it soon. The family business was doing well, but Charles ran it, not Daniel. Daniel's only real asset was his expected inheritance from his father. So you think he had me kidnapped to, what, reduce the number of heirs? The idea was so monstrous I could barely form the words. It's a working theory, Agent Webb said, and it's supported by what happened after Eleanor's disappearance. Look at this. She showed me financial records from 1995. 1 year after you vanished, Daniel Kingsley suddenly came into $5 million. He reported it as an investment from a private equity firm, but we've traced that firm, and it was essentially a shell company. The money appeared to come from nowhere, with no legitimate business transaction to explain it. I felt cold all over. He paid off his debts. Every single one. Within 6 months, Daniel was solvent again, living comfortably, and he'd secured a position on the board of Kingsley Hotels. Agent Chen's expression was grim. The timing is too perfect to be coincidental. We believe Daniel may have orchestrated your kidnapping, then paid himself from family resources he gained access to after your disappearance changed the inheritance structure. But the ransom money, my adoptive parents had $50,000 in ransom money. Where does that fit? Agent Webb leaned forward. That's what we're still piecing together. Our theory is that Daniel hired someone, likely Thomas Chen, the security guard, to carry out the actual kidnapping. Chen may have demanded part of the ransom as payment, which is why the money showed up with your adoptive parents. They may have been another layer in the chain paid to take you and keep you hidden. But why not just... I couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the horrible thought. Agent Chen said it for me, his voice gentle but unflinching. Why not kill you? That's what you're asking. And honestly, we don't know. In our experience, family kidnappings motivated by inheritance rarely end with the victim alive. It's too risky. The fact that you survived, that you were placed with a family rather than... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Disposed of suggests either a change of plans or someone in the chain who couldn't go through with murder. Maybe Thomas Chen, Agent Webb added. Maybe he was hired to take you permanently, but couldn't bring himself to hurt a baby. So he found your adoptive parents, people who wanted a child and wouldn't ask too many questions. That would explain why they kept evidence they knew something wasn't right, but they weren't the primary criminals. I sat there absorbing this, trying to match this new theory with everything I'd learned. So Daniel is still alive. He's still out there and he has no idea I've been found." "Exactly," Agent Webb said. "And that's what makes this extremely dangerous. If Daniel orchestrated your kidnapping 30 years ago to secure his inheritance, and he finds out you're alive and that your identity has been confirmed, you become a threat to everything he's built. Not just his wealth, but his freedom. This is a federal kidnapping case, April. There's no statute of limitations. If we can prove he was behind it, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison." Agent Chen's expression was deadly serious. "In our experience, family kidnappings for money rarely end with the victim alive. You're an anomaly, April, and the person who orchestrated this won't want that anomaly walking into the Kingsley estate tomorrow and exposing everything." The weight of Agent Chen's words settled over me like a physical thing. I was supposed to die. Some part of me had already suspected it, but hearing it stated so plainly made it real in a way I hadn't been prepared for. I sat there in the FBI office, surrounded by financial documents that traced greed and desperation back 30 years, and I realized that my entire existence was an accident, a deviation from someone's plan. "We need to understand your father's exact role," Agent Webb said as though reading my thoughts. "We have his employment records from the Kingsley hotels. Would you like to see them?" She pulled up a personnel file on her laptop, and I found myself looking at a much younger version of Robert Hayes, my adoptive father, in what appeared to be an employee ID photo from 1991. He looked so young, barely out of his 20s, with hopeful eyes that bore no resemblance to the defeated man I'd confronted earlier that day. Agent Chen read from the file, "Hired August 1991 as maintenance staff at Kingsley Newport Grand Hotel. Initial reviews were satisfactory. But look at this." He pointed to a notation from March 1993. "Supervisor reported Hayes was found in restricted areas of the hotel on multiple occasions without authorization. Once in the family's private wing, once near the security office. When questioned, he claimed he was checking for maintenance issues, but there were no work orders to support that." "He was fired?" I asked, though I could already see the termination date. "May 93. Officially for policy violations and suspicious behaviour, but the documentation is deliberately vague, which suggests the hotel didn't want to make formal accusations they couldn't prove." Agent Webb scrolled down. "What's interesting is that he left without any legal challenge, no unemployment claim, no attempt to fight the termination. People who are wrongfully fired usually push back. He just disappeared. And then showed up with a baby 13 months later," I said quietly. The FBI agents exchanged glances. "We need to question him formally," Agent Webb said. "But we wanted you to see this first. April, your father, had access to the Kingsley estate for nearly 2 years. He would have known the layout, the security protocols, the family's routines, and he was fired just over a year before Eleanor was taken. That's exactly the kind of gap you'd expect if someone was planning something. I thought about this man who'd raised me quiet, often distant, working long hours, at unremarkable jobs that never seemed to lead anywhere. Had he been living with this guilt his entire adult life? Can I try talking to him again? One more time before you bring him in?" Agent Webb looked sceptical. "April, he's already proven he won't tell you the truth voluntarily." "I know, but I need to try." I didn't entirely understand my own motivation, except that some part of me still wanted to believe there was an explanation that would make this hurt less. "Just give me tomorrow morning. If I don't get anything useful, you can question him however you need to." They reluctantly agreed, and I left the FBI building near midnight, exhausted and overwhelmed. But instead of going back to my hotel, I found myself driving to Medford, to the house where I'd grown up. The lights were still on when I arrived, and I sat in my car for a long moment, gathering courage. I let myself in quietly through the kitchen door. My mother was asleep. I could hear her soft snoring from the bedroom upstairs, but my father was in his study, a small, converted bedroom where he kept his tools and paperwork, and old electronics he was always meaning to fix. The door was ajar, and I could hear his voice low and urgent. I stood in the hallway hidden in shadow and listened. "You don't understand," he was saying into his phone, his voice tight with panic. "She knows. The FBI has been talking to her, showing her things. If she finds out everything, we're both going to prison. You promised this would never come back to us. You promised you'd protect my family if I kept quiet." There was a pause while the person on the other end responded. I couldn't hear the words, but the tone was sharp, angry, accusatory. "I did what you asked." My father's voice rose, then dropped again as he remembered to stay quiet. "I've kept my mouth shut for 30 years. I never asked for money, never tried to contact you, never told anyone what really happened. But now the FBI has her DNA. They have old case files, they're putting it all together. You need to do something." Another pause. His hand was shaking so badly I could see the phone trembling against his ear. "I know what I agreed to. But you said she'd have a better life. You said the family was dangerous for her, that she'd be safer with us." His voice cracked. "You said we were protecting her, not participating in a crime. You lied to us, and now it's all falling apart." I pressed myself against the wall, barely breathing, recording every word on my phone. This was evidence proof that someone else had been pulling the strings, that my father wasn't the mastermind, but a participant in something larger. "Please," he whispered, now all the fight draining out of him. "My wife, my daughter Lily, they had nothing to do with this. If charges come, it should just be me. I'm the one who brought her home. I'm the one who—" He broke off, listening to whatever the person on the other end was saying. I leaned closer, desperate to hear more, and the floorboard creaked under my weight. My father's head snapped up. "I have to go," he said quickly, and ended the call. When he came to the study door and found me standing there, his face went grey. "April, how long have you been—" "Who were you talking to?" I demanded. "Who's they? Who told you to take me?" He opened his mouth closed. It opened it again. For a long moment, he just stared at me, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before, not just guilt, but fear. "You can't go to Newport tomorrow, please, April. You don't understand what you're walking into." "Then, help me understand. Tell me the truth. All of it." He shook his head slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely audible, as though he was terrified someone else might hear. "We only did what they told us. They said they were saving the baby from something worse. They said the family was torn apart, that there were people who wanted to hurt her. We thought—" His voice broke completely. "We thought we were helping." I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my hotel room replaying the recording of my father's phone call over and over, trying to parse meaning from his desperate words. Someone had convinced him they were saving me, protecting me from something dangerous within the Kingsley family itself. But was that the truth, or just a convenient lie to get him to cooperate? And who was on the other end of that call, the person my father was clearly terrified of, after all these years? By morning, I'd sent the recording to Agent Webb, who called immediately to tell me this was significant evidence and that they'd be bringing my father in for formal questioning within the next 48 hours. "But you should still go to Newport today," she said. "Meeting your biological mother might help clarify what you were supposedly being saved from, and we'll have agents nearby the entire time." The drive to Newport felt surreal. I'd rented a car rather than accepting the Kingsley family's offer of a private driver needing some control over my own movements, some escape route if things went wrong. As I crossed the border into Rhode Island, the landscape shifted from urban sprawl to coastal elegance, historic mansions, pristine beaches, the kind of old money wealth that builds empires and preserves them across generations. The Kingsley estate sat on a cliff overlooking the ocean, behind tall iron gates that swung open automatically as I approached. The house itself was enormous, a stone mansion that managed to look both imposing and elegant, with wings extending in multiple directions and grounds that seemed to stretch forever. This was where I should have grown up. This was the life that had been stolen from me. A man in a dark suit met me at the circular driveway, Mr. Whitmore, the family attorney I'd spoken with on the phone. "Ms. Martinez," he said warmly, though I noticed he didn't call me Eleanor. "Thank you for coming. Mrs. Kingsley is waiting for you in the main parlour. She's very emotional today. I hope you will be patient with her." He led me through a grand entrance hall, lined with family portraits spanning what looked like a century. I recognised some of the faces from my FBI research. Charles Kingsley, Eleanor's father, who died of a heart attack in 2001, just 7 years after losing his daughter. His sister, Margaret. And there, looking younger and more innocent in an oil painting, was Daniel Kingsley, the uncle the FBI suspected of orchestrating my kidnapping. The portrait showed him at perhaps 30, handsome and confident, with eyes that revealed nothing of what he might be capable of. But it was the photographs that made me stop breathing. An entire wall was devoted to baby Eleanor, professional portraits and candid shots chronologically arranged like a shrine. I moved closer, studying the face of the child I'd been, and it was like looking at pictures of myself that I'd never seen before. The resemblance was undeniable, haunting. In one photo, the baby was laughing, reaching for the camera with chubby hands. In another, she was sleeping peacefully in someone's arms. Each image represented a moment of a life I couldn't remember, a childhood that had been severed completely. "That's the last photo we have of her," Miss Whitmore said quietly, pointing to a portrait of Eleanor in a pink dress with white lace. "Taken 2 days before she disappeared. Mrs. Kingsley looks at it every day." We continued through the house, and I tried to absorb everything, the elegance, the history, the weight of wealth that permeated every room. This wasn't just a home, it was a legacy, a physical manifestation of power and privilege that people would kill for. The FBI's theory about inheritance suddenly made perfect terrible sense. The parlour was a bright room with tall windows overlooking the ocean, and there, standing near those windows, with her back to the door, was a woman with silver-streaked dark hair wearing an elegant cream-coloured dress. When she heard us enter, she turned, and I found myself looking at Marianne Kingsley for the first time. She was beautiful, in the way wealthy older women often are, well-maintained, carefully dressed, but with an underlying fragility that suggested deep suffering. Her eyes found mine, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then her gaze dropped to the side of my neck, visible above my collar where my heart-shaped birthmark had always been. "Oh God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh God, it's really you." She crossed the room so fast I barely had time to brace myself before she was pulling me into an embrace, her whole body shaking with of course. She smelled like expensive perfume and grief, and her arms around me were desperate, clutching, as though she was afraid I might disappear again if she let go. 30 years, she kept saying over and over. 30 years I've dreamed of this moment. 30 years I've prayed you were alive, somewhere safe and healthy. My baby, my Eleanor. I stood rigid in her embrace, overwhelmed by her emotion, not knowing how to respond. This woman was my mother by biology, but she was also a complete stranger. I had no memories of her, no instinctive recognition, no feeling of coming home. Instead, I felt like an imposter, someone pretending to be the daughter she'd lost. When she finally released me, she kept her hands on my shoulders, studying my face with hungry intensity. "You look like your father," she said, tears still streaming down her face. "Charles, you have his eyes, his chin. Oh, how he would have loved to see this day. He died believing you were gone forever." "I'm sorry." I managed, because what else could I say? "I'm sorry I don't remember you. I'm sorry your husband died of grief. I'm sorry I can't be the daughter you lost, only the stranger I've become." She led me through the house, talking constantly, showing me rooms and photographs, trying to fill 30 years of absence with words. We ended up in a wing of the mansion I hadn't seen yet, in front of a closed door that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. "This was your nursery," Marianne said softly. "I've kept it exactly as it was. I know it seems morbid, but I couldn't bear to change anything. It was the last place I saw you before. She couldn't finish the sentence. She opened the door and I stepped into a time capsule. The room was frozen. In 1994, a white crib with pink bedding toys arranged neatly on shelves. A rocking chair by the window where a mother had once sat with her baby. Everything was preserved, dust-free, maintained like a museum exhibit to a child who never got to grow up here. Every night for the first 10 years, I came in here and sat in that chair. Marianne said, her voice breaking. I sang lullabies to an empty room. I rocked back and forth with my arms empty, pretending you were still there. The doctors said it was unhealthy, that I needed to move on. But how do you move on from losing your child when you don't know if she's alive or dead? I felt tears burning my own eyes now. Not for myself, but for her, for this woman who'd spent 3 decades trapped in grief, unable to heal because she'd never had closure. Whatever role the Kingsley family had played in my kidnapping, Marianne was clearly a victim too. We spent the next hour talking, or rather she talked while I listened. She told me about my father Charles, about their marriage, about their joy when I was born after years of trying. She showed me more photographs, shared stories I had no memory of, tried desperately to create a connection across a 30-year void. But I was aware of other presence in the house. Several times I caught glimpses of people in doorways or hallways, other family members watching, whispering. Their expressions weren't all welcoming. Some looked suspicious, others looked calculating. Later, when Marianne excused herself to compose herself, I wandered back toward the main hall. That's when I heard voices from a side room, Mr. Whitmore talking to someone I couldn't see. I'm telling you, we need to verify everything again, a man's voice said urgently. Yes, the DNA matches, but we've had 6 imposters over the years, people with elaborate stories and forged documents. The estate is worth too much to make a mistake based purely on science that could be manipulated. The FBI has confirmed her identity, Mr. Whitmore replied calmly. We have multiple independent lab results. This isn't like the others. Still, Daniel is watching this very closely. He called me this morning asking pointed questions about the inheritance structure, about what Eleanor's return would mean for the existing will. We need to be absolutely certain before this goes any further. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering. Daniel. The uncle who'd supposedly orchestrated my kidnapping was watching, asking questions, preparing for something. And, despite the FBI's warnings, despite everything, I knew I was standing in his family's home, exposed and vulnerable, with no idea who I could actually trust. I left the Kingsley estate that afternoon with Marianne's desperate pleas ringing in my ears. Come back soon. Stay longer next time. Let me show you the rest of the house, introduce you to more of the family. We have so much lost time to make up for. But all I could think about was the conversation I'd overheard Daniel's name spoken with a mixture of respect and fear, the implication that he was watching, calculating, preparing for something. Agent Webb had called during my drive back to Boston. We've flagged Daniel Kingsley for surveillance. He hasn't made any suspicious moves yet, but we're monitoring his communications and movements. How did the meeting go? Marianne is genuine, I said. Her grief is real. But there are others in that family who aren't happy about my return. And Daniel knows I exist now. Everyone keeps saying he's watching closely. That's exactly what concerns us. April, I want you back in protective custody. At least until we can question your father and piece together the full chain of command. But I'd insisted on going back to my own apartment, to my own space, needing just one night of normalcy before my entire world shifted permanently. Agent Webb had reluctantly agreed, making me promise to keep my doors locked and call immediately if anything seemed wrong. The first night home, I noticed nothing unusual. I fell into bed, exhausted, emotionally, wrung out from meeting Marianne and seeing the life I should have lived. The second night, I was working late on my laptop when movement outside my window caught my attention. A dark sedan was parked across the street engine, off someone sitting in the driver's seat. Boston was full of parked cars, and I told myself I was being paranoid, seeing threats where none existed. But on the third night, the same car was there again, And this time, when I looked closely through my curtains, I could see the silhouette of someone holding something up to their face. Binoculars. Someone was watching my apartment, and they weren't being subtle about it. I called Agent Webb immediately. She sent a patrol car, but by the time it arrived, the sedan was gone. "We'll increase drive-bys," the officer told me. "Keep your curtains closed and don't go out alone after dark." The next morning, I found an envelope tucked under my windshield wiper. No postage, no markings, just a plain manila envelope that made my stomach drop before I even opened it. Inside was a single photograph, baby Eleanor in her pink dress, the same image from the Kingsley Estate's portrait wall, and a typed message on plain white paper. "Someone in that house knows the truth. Stop asking questions." My hand shook as I photographed the envelope and its contents before calling the FBI. Agent Chen arrived within 20 minutes to collect it as evidence. "This is an escalation," he said grimly. "Someone feels threatened by your investigation. The question is whether this is coming from the Kingsley family or from someone else who doesn't want the past uncovered. Could it be my father, or whoever he was talking to on the phone? It's possible. We've identified the number he called. It's a burner phone, untraceable. Whoever your father was speaking to has been careful to stay hidden for 30 years. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the message about the watcher in the car, about Daniel Kingsley asking questions about inheritance. Around midnight, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but some instinct made me pick up. "Hello." At first, there was only silence. Then a voice spoke digitally distorted, neither clearly male nor female, with an artificial quality that made my skin crawl. "April Martinez, or should I say Eleanor Kingsley, you need to stop what you're doing." "Who is this? The Kingsley family has secrets that can't come out. Your mother's grief is real, but there are others who won't let you destroy what's been carefully built over 3 decades. Take the FBI's offer of witness protection. Move somewhere far away. Forget you ever took that DNA test." Why would I do that? I tried to keep my voice steady, reaching for my laptop to start recording. Because the alternative is that you'll regret ever learning the truth. You survived once because someone chose mercy. Don't count on that happening twice. The line went dead before I could respond. I sat there staring at my phone, the digital distortion still echoing in my ears. This wasn't an empty threat. This was someone who knew exactly what had happened 30 years ago, someone who'd been involved in keeping me hidden and was now desperate to keep me silent. I sent the recording to Agent Webb and spent the rest of the night with every light in my apartment on jumping at every sound. When morning finally came, Agent Chen arrived with a tech specialist who wanted to examine my home security system. "We need to check if anyone's been accessing your cameras," he explained, connecting his laptop to my network. Within minutes, his expression changed. "You've been hacked. Someone gained remote access to your security system 8 days ago. They've been watching your camera feeds." "Can you see what they saw?" He shook his head. "They deleted 3 full days of footage. Whatever they were observing, they didn't want any record of it. But this level of sophistication, this isn't amateur hour. Whoever did this has resources and technical knowledge." Agent Chen's phone rang and he stepped away to answer it. When he came back, his expression was troubled. "That was a blocked number. They hung up immediately when I answered. But it came right after I arrived at your apartment. April, someone is watching right now. They know when FBI agents come and go." The paranoia was becoming suffocating. I felt eyes on me constantly, whether I was home or at work, driving or walking. Every car that followed too long, every person who glanced my way, every unexpected phone call made my heart race with fear. I was spiraling, unable to trust anyone, when my phone rang again. This time it was a local Rhode Island number, and when I answered cautiously, a man's voice said, "Ms. Martinez, this is Thomas Grant. I'm head of security at the Kingsley Estate. I shouldn't be calling you directly, but I think you need to know something." "What is it?" There's someone in the Kingsley family who never gave up looking for Eleanor. Mrs. Catherine Kingsley, Marianne's younger sister. She spent 20 years hiring private investigators, following leads, refusing to let the case go cold, even when everyone else moved on. He paused. She has information about what happened in '94. Information she's been too afraid to share because she suspected it would put her in danger. But now that you're here, now that Eleanor has been found, she wants to talk to you. Privately, without the FBI or family attorneys knowing. Why should I trust you? How do I know this isn't another threat? You don't, he admitted, but Catherine Kingsley has been trying to find you for 2 decades. She's not your enemy. She might be the only person in that family who can tell you the whole truth. I agreed to meet Catherine Kingsley the following evening, but only in a public location with FBI agents nearby. Agent Webb was against it initially, calling it too risky, but I convinced her that if Catherine truly had information about '94, we couldn't afford to ignore it. We arranged to meet at a restaurant in Providence, halfway between Boston and Newport, where Agent Chen could maintain visual surveillance from a nearby table. Catherine Kingsley arrived exactly on time, and I recognised her immediately from the family photos I'd seen at the estate, Marianne's younger sister, though the 2 women looked nothing alike. Where Marianne was elegant and fragile, Catherine had a sharp, assessing quality, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing and a no-nonsense demeanour that suggested she'd spent a lifetime dealing with difficult people. She slid into the booth across from me and studied my face, with the same hungry intensity her sister had shown, but without the tears. You have Charles's bone structure, she said matter-of-factly, and Marianne's colouring. The DNA might have proven who you are, but honestly, your face is evidence enough for anyone who knew the family. Your security guard said you've been looking for me for 20 years. Longer than that, actually. From the moment you disappeared, I knew something was wrong with the official story. A random kidnapping by an opportunistic criminal at a party with 40 guests and security everywhere. It never made sense. She ordered coffee when the server appeared, waiting until we were alone again before continuing. I started hiring private investigators in '96, once it became clear the FBI investigation was going nowhere. I spent my own money, quite a lot of it, actually, following leads, interviewing witnesses the police had missed, trying to find any trace of what happened to you. And your family didn't support this. Catherine's laugh was bitter. Support it. They actively tried to stop me. They called it an unhealthy obsession, a waste of money, said I was prolonging everyone's grief by refusing to accept that you were probably dead. My brother Daniel was particularly vocal about it. He kept insisting I needed to let Eleanor rest in peace and move on. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. But I noticed something no one else seemed to find suspicious. Daniel was the one person who seemed relieved after you disappeared. Not grieving, not angry, but relieved. The FBI thinks he orchestrated the kidnapping for inheritance money. They're right. Catherine said it with absolute certainty. I've suspected it for years, but I could never prove it. Daniel was drowning in debt in 1994. Everyone in the family knew it, though we pretended otherwise because that's what wealthy families do. We maintain appearances. Then you vanished. And within a year, Daniel was suddenly solvent again. New car paid off mortgages, investing in businesses. He claimed it was an investment deal, but I did some digging. The company he said invested in him barely existed on paper. I thought about the FBI's financial analysis about the $5 million that appeared from nowhere. Did you tell the FBI your suspicions? I tried, but I had no concrete evidence, just observations and instincts. And Daniel is very good at appearing respectable, at playing the grieving uncle. He even contributed to the reward fund for your return, made public statements about hoping you'd be found alive. He's spent 30 years building an image of himself as one of your victims too. She stirred her coffee absently. What? The FBI doesn't know what nobody knows except Marianne and me is the state your parents' marriage was in before you were taken." This caught me off guard. "What do you mean? Your mother was planning to divorce your father. Charles was having an affair, not his first, but this one was serious. He was talking about leaving Marianne for this other woman, someone who worked at one of the hotels. Marianne was devastated, consulting with lawyers, preparing to take you and leave. The family was in crisis, though we kept it quiet." I absorbed this, trying to understand what it meant. "But after you were taken, everything changed. The affair ended immediately. Charles became devoted, desperate, consumed with grief. He and Marianne stayed together, bound by their shared loss and guilt. But it wasn't a real marriage anymore. It was a prison they had built together, two people torturing each other with what-ifs and if-onlys." Catherine's eyes were distant now, remembering. "I watched my sister die by inches over 30 years. She couldn't divorce him because leaving felt like abandoning you. He couldn't leave her because staying was his penance. They were both trapped. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to understand the family dynamics in 1994. Daniel wasn't the only one with motive. Charles's mistress disappeared right after you did, quit her job, left. Rhode Island was never heard from again. The nanny, Patricia Alden, who vanished with you. She'd only been working for the family 3 months. Who hired her? Who vouched for her references?" Catherine held my gaze. "The FBI focused on Daniel because he had the clearest financial motive. But there were other people with reasons to want you gone, or to want Marianne to suffer." My head was spinning with possibilities I hadn't considered. "Do you think Charles, my biological father, could have been involved? I don't know. He died in 2001, and if he had answers, he took them to his grave. But I do know this: Daniel was the only person outside your immediate family who had access to everything the kidnapper needed to know. He knew the security codes because he was on the hotel board. He knew the safe combination because he'd borrowed money from it before with your grandfather's permission. He knew the family's schedules because he had attended every major event." She paused. "And I know he paid someone off in 1995 because I followed him. I watched him meet with a man in Connecticut, watched him hand over a briefcase full of cash. I even got photographs." "You have photographs?" Hope surged through me. "That's evidence that could—" "I couldn't use them then. I had no legal authority to be following Daniel, no warrant, nothing official. Any lawyer would have gotten them thrown out of court as evidence from illegal surveillance. And when I tried to show them to the FBI, Daniel found out somehow. He came to my house one night and told me very clearly that if I kept digging, if I kept making accusations, I would regret it. He didn't specify what he'd do, but the threat was real enough that I stopped. I was afraid, April. I'm not proud of it, but I was genuinely afraid of what my own brother might do." She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick manila envelope sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. "This is everything I collected between 1996 and 2009 when Daniel threatened me into silence. Photographs, financial documents. I shouldn't have been able to access testimony from a private investigator I hired who interviewed witnesses the FBI never talked to. I've kept it hidden for 15 years, too afraid to use it, too guilty to destroy it." She slid the envelope across the table to me, her hand shaking slightly. "But now you're here. You're alive, you're real, and you deserve the truth. And maybe, finally, Daniel will have to answer for what he did." I stared at the envelope, this cache of evidence that Catherine had risked everything to collect and preserve. "Why are you doing this now? What changed?" "You changed everything. For 30 years, Eleanor was a ghost, a tragedy, a closed case. But you're not a ghost. You're flesh and blood, and you're asking questions that terrify the people who wanted you to stay buried." She met my eyes. "I spent 20 years looking for you, April. I'm not going to let my coward brother silence you now that you've finally been found. This is evidence I've hidden for 15 years, but I was too afraid to use it. Until now." My hands trembled as I broke the seal on the envelope, acutely aware that I was holding evidence Catherine had risked her life to collect and preserve. Agent Chen had moved closer to our table, abandoning any pretense of coincidental presence, his hand resting near his weapon as he scanned the restaurant for threats. The first document I pulled out was a bank transfer receipt, and even before I read the details, I could see it had been photocopied from an original that someone had tried very hard to keep private. The transaction date was May 14th, 1994, exactly 1 month before I was taken. The amount made my breath catch $200,000, transferred from an account under Daniel Kingsley's name to an account belonging to Thomas Chen. The memo line read simply, "Consulting Services," but the timing was damning. "I got that from a source at Daniel's bank," Catherine said quietly. "Someone who owed me a favour and was willing to risk their career. Daniel made the transfer through a small private bank rather than the family's usual institution, probably thinking it would be harder to trace. But money always leaves a trail if you know where to look." I set the receipt aside and pulled out the next document, a photocopy of what appeared to be an adoption contract, though calling it that was generous. The paper was cheaply printed with legal language that sounded official but was vague enough to be meaningless. It was dated July 20th, 1994, just over a month after my disappearance, and it documented the voluntary private adoption of baby girl DOB December 1992 from Thomas Chen to Robert and Linda Hayes. The language claimed Chen was the legal guardian, transferring parental rights, but there was no mention of how he'd acquired those rights, no court documentation, nothing that would hold up to any legal scrutiny. "That's not a real adoption," I said, stating the obvious. "No, it's a bill of sale dressed up in legal terminology. Thomas Chen sold you to your adoptive parents, and this piece of paper was supposed to give them plausible deniability if anyone ever questioned where you came from." Catherine's voice was hard now, angry in a way I hadn't heard before. "Your father probably thought it was legitimate, or at least legal enough. Chen likely told him some story about being a distant relative, about a mother who couldn't care for her child. People believe what they want to believe, especially when it gives them something they desperately want." The third document made everything horrifyingly clear: Thomas Chen's death certificate from March 1995. The cause of death was listed as vehicular accident, single car collision. But someone had attached additional papers, what looked like an internal police report that questioned the official conclusion. An investigating officer had noted that Chen's vehicle showed signs of being forced off the road, that the brake lines had been cut, that the accident scene had been staged. But the case had been closed anyway, ruled accidental with no further investigation recommended. "He died 1 week after sending Daniel a letter," Catherine said, pulling out yet another document, a photocopy of a handwritten note on cheap notebook paper. "My private investigator found this in Chen's apartment after his death, before the place was cleaned out. Chen was blackmailing Daniel. He wanted another $100,000, threatening to go to the police if Daniel didn't pay. A week later, Chen was dead, and all his personal effects mysteriously disappeared from police custody." I stared at the crude letter at Chen's messy handwriting, demanding money, and felt sick. The chain was clear now, each link leading inexorably to the next Daniel paid Thomas Chen to kidnap me. Chen took me from the estate and held me somewhere for over a month. Then Chen, either because he couldn't bring himself to kill a baby, or because he saw an opportunity for additional profit, sold me to my adoptive parents through a fake adoption. But Chen got greedy, tried to extort more money from Daniel, and was eliminated for it. "This is murder," I whispered. "Daniel didn't just orchestrate a kidnapping, he killed someone to cover it up." "Yes," Catherine said simply, "and he'll kill again if he feels threatened. That's why I've been silent for 15 years. After I started asking too many questions, after I tried to show some of this evidence to authorities, Daniel came to my house. He was very calm, very reasonable, He told me that accidents happen all the time, especially to people who don't know when to stop interfering. He told me about a friend of his who died in a house fire, about another business partner who'd had a fatal mugging. He never explicitly threatened me, but the message was crystal clear. Agent Chen had heard enough. He was already on his phone, presumably calling Agent Webb, photographing every document on the table with his cell phone. "This changes everything," he said. "We have financial documentation, we have the fake adoption papers, we have evidence of blackmail and a suspicious death. Combined with what we already know about Daniel's debt and sudden wealth, we have enough for an arrest warrant." But Catherine was shaking her head, her earlier confidence cracking. "You don't understand how powerful Daniel is, how many connections he has. He spent 30 years building relationships with judges, prosecutors, police chiefs. He makes generous donations to law enforcement charities. He sits on boards with people who can make evidence disappear, who can influence investigations. I tried to expose him before, and I watched my evidence get dismissed, buried, explained away." "That was 15 years ago," Agent Chen countered. "The FBI has jurisdiction now, and we don't answer to local connections. With April's testimony, with your evidence, with the forensic analysis we're conducting. My brother is still alive and very dangerous." Catherine interrupted, her voice trembling now. "He's eliminated everyone who threatened him before. The security guard who had questions about the kidnapping dead in a car accident 2 years later. The hotel employee who saw too much, disappeared, never found. The private investigator I hired who got too close. He was found dead of an apparent overdose despite having no history of drug use." She looked at me with genuine fear. "You need to understand what you're up against. Daniel has been killing witnesses and covering his tracks for 3 decades. He's not going to stop now, especially when his freedom is at stake." Catherine's words hung in the air like a death sentence, and I felt the weight of 30 years of murder and cover-ups pressing down on me. Agent Chen was still on the phone with his superiors, his voice low and urgent as he relayed the significance of what we'd found. I sat there surrounded by photocopies and bank statements, evidence of crimes that stretched back before I could even remember, and I tried to process the fact that someone in my biological family had been willing to kill repeatedly to keep me hidden. That's when something clicked in my memory, something I'd never thought to question before. "Wait," I said, interrupting Catherine mid-sentence. "My adoptive uncle, my father's younger brother Mark, he was a cop, a detective in Boston." The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. "He used to tell stories about his cases at family dinners when I was growing up. He retired early, moved away when I was still a teenager. I always thought it was strange that he left so suddenly, that we never heard from him much after that." Agent Chen's attention snapped to me. "What was his full name?" "Mark Hayes. Marcus Hayes, officially. He would have been," I did the math quickly, "38 or 39 in 1995. He took early retirement right around then. My father said it was because Mark wanted to travel, that he'd saved up enough money to live comfortably." Agent Chen was already pulling up files on his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Mark Hayes, Boston PD detective, worked major crimes." His expression changed as he read. "April, your uncle was one of the lead investigators on Eleanor Kingsley's kidnapping case." The restaurant suddenly felt too small, too hot. "That's not possible. That's too much of a coincidence." "It's not a coincidence," Catherine said grimly. "It's part of the conspiracy. Daniel would have needed someone inside law enforcement to make sure the investigation went nowhere, to bury evidence, to close the case prematurely." Agent Chen was reading through old case files now, his expression growing darker. "Look at this. Detective Hayes wrote multiple reports downplaying leads that pointed toward hotel employees. He interviewed your adoptive father, Robert, as a potential witness since Robert had worked at the Kingsley Hotel, but Hayes's report concludes that Robert had no useful information and wasn't worth following up with. He actively redirected the investigation away from anyone connected to the hotel staff. "Show me," I demanded, moving to look over his shoulder. The reports were clinical and professional, but once I knew what to look for, the pattern was obvious. Every time another investigator suggested looking more closely at recently terminated hotel employees, Mark Hayes wrote memos explaining why that lead wasn't promising. Every time someone wanted to interview Robert about his knowledge of the estate's layout, Mark convinced them it was a waste of time. He'd systematically steered the entire investigation away from the truth. Agent Chen pulled up Mark's financial records, which the FBI had already been examining, as part of the broader investigation into my case. September 1994, 3 months after Eleanor disappeared, Mark Hayes received a wire transfer of $50,000 from an offshore account registered to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. The account was closed 2 weeks after the transfer, making it essentially untraceable. 50,000, I repeated. The same amount my adoptive parents had hidden in their garage, the ransom money. Probably from the same source, Agent Chen agreed. Daniel paid Mark to close the investigation, just like he paid Thomas Chen to take you, just like he paid your adoptive parents to keep you hidden. He spread the money around, creating a network of complicit parties who all had financial incentive to stay quiet. Catherine was nodding. And when Chen tried to demand more money, Daniel killed him. That would have sent a message to everyone else involved: stay silent or die. "Where is Mark Hayes now?" I asked. "If he knows all of this, if he was part of covering it up, we need to find him." Agent Chen's fingers moved across his keyboard again, accessing databases I didn't have clearance to see. "That's the thing. Mark Hayes officially lives at an address in Dorchester, Massachusetts. Property taxes get paid every year, utilities are maintained. But according to border crossing records, he's been living in Mexico for the past 15 years, Playa del Carmen, under the name Marcus Haynes, close enough to his real name that he'd respond to it different enough that casual searches wouldn't find him." "He's hiding," I said. "He's been hiding since 2009, Agent Chen corrected. "Right around the time the case file was digitized and uploaded to national databases. Maybe he got nervous that someone would eventually connect the dots, see the patterns in his investigative work. So he disappeared to a place where US law enforcement couldn't easily reach him." My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Webb. "We have enough for arrest warrants. Daniel Kingsley for kidnapping conspiracy to commit murder and murder. Mark Hayes for obstruction of justice, accepting bribes and conspiracy. Getting federal prosecutors involved now. Need April in protective custody immediately." Agent Chen read his own message from Agent Webb and stood up. "We need to move. If Daniel has any idea we're this close, he might run or try to eliminate more witnesses. April, we're taking you into federal protection right now. Catherine will need you to come with us as well. You're a crucial witness, and you're also in danger." Catherine nodded, already gathering her belongings. "What about Mark if he's in Mexico?" "Mexico has extradition treaties with the United States," Agent Chen said. "We're already coordinating with Mexican federal police and US Marshals. We'll have him located within 24 hours. His phone rang and he answered it immediately. "Yes, Mum. We have the evidence. All of it." He listened for a moment, then looked at me. "Agent Webb says to tell you that Mark Hayes has 2 options. He returns voluntarily to testify, or we arrest him for obstruction of justice. Either way, he's coming back." The FBI moved Catherine and me to a secure location within the hour, a safe house in suburban Boston that looked like every other bland colonial on the street, but had reinforced doors and agents stationed at every entrance. Agent Webb met us there along with 2 federal prosecutors who wanted to review all of Catherine's evidence and begin building their case. But as I sat in that sterile living room watching lawyers photograph documents and discuss legal strategies, something shifted inside me. For 2 weeks, I'd been reactive, letting other people, the FBI, my adoptive parents, the Kingsleys, control the narrative and dictate what happened next. I'd been treated like a victim who needed protection, a fragile piece of evidence that had to be carefully preserved. And while I understood the necessity of that approach, I was tired of being passive. I was a financial risk analyst. I spent my professional life tracing money flows, identifying patterns in complex data building models that predicted behavior based on financial incentives. Everything about this case was fundamentally about money, inheritance, debts, bribes, ransom. And if there was one thing I was exceptionally good at, it was following money trails. I want to help, I said, interrupting the lawyer's discussion of admissibility standards. I want to analyse all the financial evidence, create a comprehensive timeline and money flow analysis. I do this for a living, and I can probably spot connections you might miss. Agent Webb looked sceptical. April, I appreciate the offer, but we have forensic accountants who specialise in criminal investigations. Your job is to stay safe and prepare to testify. Your forensic accountants are looking for evidence of specific crimes. I'm suggesting something different. A comprehensive financial narrative that shows motive, means, and opportunity all in one analysis. I pulled out my laptop, which the FBI had thoroughly scanned for malware, before allowing me to keep it. Give me access to everything you have. Daniel's financial records, Thomas Chen's accounts, Mark Hayes' transactions, the ransom payment, your details, all of it. Let me build you a model that a jury can actually understand. Agent Webb exchanged glances with the prosecutors who seemed intrigued despite themselves. What exactly are you proposing? Over the next 6 hours working with FBI financial analysts who provided me with the redacted copies of evidence, I built something that made the entire conspiracy visible at a glance. I created a detailed spreadsheet tracking every dollar, every transaction, every financial decision that led to my kidnapping. The timeline was ruthlessly precise. August 1991, Robert Hayes, hired at Kingsley Newport Grand Hotel. May 1993, Robert terminated for suspicious behaviour. January 1994, Daniel Kingsley's debts reach critical point creditors, threatening legal action. March 1994, Eleanor's grandfather announces intention to revise will to include all grandchildren equally. May 14th, 1994, Daniel transfers $200,000 to Thomas Chen. June 15th, 94, Eleanor disappears from Kingsley Estate. July 2094, fake adoption contract dated transferring baby girl to Robert and Linda Hayes. September 12th, 94, Mark Hayes receives $50,000 from offshore account. September 30, 1994, Mark Hayes writes report recommending case be downgraded from active to cold. March 3rd, 1995, Thomas Chen sends letter demanding $100,000 from Daniel. March 10th of 95, Thomas Chen dies in suspicious accident. June 95, Daniel receives $5 million from Shell Company, pays off all debts. I colour-coded everything red for Daniel's transactions, blue for payments to conspirators, green for subsequent wealth acquisition. The visual made the cause and effect impossible to deny. Every dollar Daniel spent led directly to my disappearance, and every dollar he gained came from inheritance he secured by removing me from the equation. The FBI analysts were impressed. One of them, a woman named Dr. Sarah Kim, studied my work for a long moment before saying, "This is prosecution gold. You've just made this case comprehensible for a jury who might not understand complex financial fraud. They'll be able to see exactly how this conspiracy worked." But there was still one crucial piece missing. I turned to Catherine, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner. "You said you confronted Daniel in 2004. Tell me exactly what happened." Catherine's expression was pained. "It was at a family Christmas gathering. Daniel had been drinking, celebrating some business deal. I was so angry watching him laugh and toast his success when I knew what he'd done. I followed him outside when he went to smoke a cigar, and I recorded our conversation on my phone." "You have audio?" She nodded slowly. "He was drunk enough to be careless. When I accused him of being involved in Eleanor's disappearance, he didn't deny it. He said," her voice broke, "he said that baby had to disappear or we'd all have lost everything." He was talking about the inheritance, about protecting the family fortune. He actually tried to justify it like it was a business decision. Where's the recording? In the envelope. At the very bottom on an old phone I've kept locked in a safety deposit box for 15 years. I found it an ancient flip phone battery dead. Agent Webb took it to their tech specialists, and within an hour they'd extracted the audio file. We all listened in silence as a younger Catherine's voice confronted Daniel, and a slurring, arrogant Daniel Kingsley responded. The baby had to disappear. Father was going to split everything 6 ways instead of 3. We'd have lost half our inheritance to grandchildren who hadn't earned any of it. It was a necessary adjustment, Catherine. You'd understand if you had any head for business. The recording was damning. I immediately asked Agent Webb about legal admissibility, about chain of custody, about whether Catherine's secret recording would hold up in court. It's complicated, she admitted. Recording laws vary by state and defence lawyers will challenge it. But combined with everything else, the financial evidence, Mark Hayes' eventual testimony, the pattern of suspicious deaths, it's devastating. I was still processing this, coordinating with the FBI to ensure every piece of evidence was properly documented and traceable when my burner phone rang. The FBI had given it to me that morning, insisting I use it for all communications. Only a handful of people had the number. The voice on the other end was digitally distorted again, the same artificial quality that had threatened me before. Clever girl, building your little spreadsheets. But that recording won't hold up in court, and you know it. Your aunt made it illegally without consent. Any competent lawyer will get it thrown out. Stop now, April. Stop while you can still walk away alive. Agent Webb grabbed the phone from my hand and immediately began tracing the call, but we both knew it would lead nowhere. These people had been covering their tracks for 30 years. What terrified me more than the threat itself was the timing. I'd received this burner phone only that morning. Fewer than 10 people knew the number, all of them FBI agents or federal prosecutors. Either we had a leak, or whoever was threatening me had access to law enforcement communications. We're moving you again, Agent Webb said immediately. Different location, smaller team, need to know basis only. Someone is getting information they shouldn't have. But before we could leave, I needed to go back to my apartment one last time to collect essential documents, work files, personal items, things I'd need if I was going to be in protective custody for weeks. Agent Chen drove me there himself, checking the building thoroughly before allowing me inside. We were only going to be there for 15 minutes in and out, nothing that would give anyone time to set up an ambush. I was gathering files from my home office when Agent Chen called out from the parking garage below. April, don't come down here. Stay in your apartment. But something in his voice made me ignore the command. I took the stairs down and found him crouched beside my car, examining the undercarriage with a flashlight. What is it? He stood up, his face grim. Your brake lines have been cut, not fully severed. Whoever did this was more sophisticated than that. They made incisions that would have held under normal city driving, but would have failed completely the first time you hit the brakes at highway speed. This was designed to look like an accident. My legs went weak. I'd been planning to drive to work tomorrow morning to tie up loose ends before taking leave from my job. The route from Cambridge to downtown Boston included a stretch of Route 2 where I regularly drove 60 miles per hour. If I'd gotten in this car without checking if Agent Chen hadn't been cautious enough to look underneath. Thomas Chen, I whispered. They killed him the same way, didn't they? Made it look like an accident. That's the pattern, Agent Chen confirmed. And it means whoever is behind this knows you well enough to know your routine, your car, your schedule. This took planning and access to your parking garage. Within an hour, I was in a different safe house with a different protection team, and the FBI had begun an internal investigation into potential information leaks. Agent Webb had gone quiet and tense, the kind of controlled fury that suggested someone was going to face serious consequences for compromising my safety. I was sitting in yet another bland living room drinking coffee I couldn't taste when there was a knock at the door. The agents cleared the visitor, and to my shock, Lily walked in. My sister looked like she hadn't slept in days, her eyes red-rimmed and her usually perfect appearance dishevelled. "I need to talk to you," she said without preamble. "Please. I know you have no reason to listen to me, but please." Agent Webb started to intervene, but I held up my hand. "It's okay. Let her stay." Lily sat across from me, and for a long moment she just stared at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. "I've been horrible to you our entire lives. The DNA kit, the constant comparisons making you feel small. I did it on purpose because I knew." "Knew what?" "I didn't know you were kidnapped. I didn't know about Eleanor Kingsley or any of that. But I knew Mum and Dad didn't love you the way they should. I could see it even as a kid. They'd hug me and kiss me and tell me they were proud of me for the smallest things. But with you, there was always this distance, this holding back. And I didn't understand why, so I hated you for it. I thought you'd done something to make them stop loving you. And I was terrified they'd stop loving me too if I wasn't perfect enough." Tears were streaming down her face now. "I made your life hell because I was trying to make sure I stayed the favourite. And now I know the truth, that they couldn't love you because they were guilty, because every time they looked at you, they saw their crime. And I'm so sorry." Something broke inside me at her words. All the years of cruelty, of feeling invisible and inadequate, and it had never been about me at all. Lily and I were both victims of our parents' choices, just in different ways. I reached across the space between us and pulled her into an embrace, and we both cried for the childhood we should have had, for the sisters we could have been if our family hadn't been built on lies. When we finally pulled apart, Lily's expression turned frightened. "There's something else. I heard Dad on the phone last night. He was crying, begging someone. He said, 'Please don't hurt her. She's just trying to find the truth. You promised no one else would get hurt.'" "Okay, boss." And the person on the other end said something I couldn't hear, but Dad's response was, "I know what they said. They promised April wouldn't survive if she doesn't stop. But I can't lose another daughter. I don't know what to do." Before I could process this, the implication that my adoptive father was trying to protect me despite everything, Agent Webb's phone rang. She answered it, listened intently, and her expression shifted from concern to something like triumph. "That was the US Marshal Service. They've arrested Mark Hayes at the Tijuana border crossing. He was trying to re-enter Mexico after making a quick trip to California, probably to meet with someone. But we had him flagged and they picked him up within minutes." She looked at me directly. "He's willing to testify fully in exchange for a plea deal. And, according to the agent who's with him now, he has a lot to say." Mark Hayes was brought to a federal facility in Boston the following morning, and I watched his interrogation through a one-way mirror alongside Agent Webb and 2 federal prosecutors. He looked nothing like the uncle I remembered from childhood, that confident, jovial man who told war stories about catching criminals. This Mark Hayes was gaunt and grey, his hands shaking as he signed the plea agreement his lawyer had negotiated. In exchange for his full cooperation and testimony, he'd face reduced charges with a recommended sentence of 5 to 7 years, instead of the 20+ he'd be facing for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. "For the record, please state your full name and occupation," the lead prosecutor began once the cameras were recording. "Marcus Theodore Hayes, retired Boston police detective, retired in 1995. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "And you understand that this testimony is being given under oath, that any false statements constitute perjury, and that your plea agreement is contingent on your full and truthful cooperation?" "Yes." What followed was 3 hours of testimony that filled in every gap in the story I'd been piecing together. Mark spoke haltingly at first, then, with increasing fluidity, as though unburdening himself of 30 years of guilt. "In May of 1994, my brother Robert called me. He said a man named Daniel Kingsley wanted to meet with me, that it was about a business opportunity. I met Daniel at a restaurant in Providence. He was very direct. He told me the Kingsley family was having internal problems, that his father was about to change his will in a way that would devastate the family business, and that sometimes difficult decisions had to be made for the greater good. Mark's lawyer interjected to clarify that his client had initially believed he was being recruited for legitimate security consulting. But Mark shook his head. No, I knew what he was asking. He offered me $50,000 to make sure that if anything happened involving the Kingsley family, the investigation wouldn't go anywhere useful. He said he needed someone inside law enforcement who could guide things in the right direction. The prosecutor leaned forward. Did Daniel Kingsley explicitly tell you he was planning to have his niece kidnapped? Not in those words. He said the family needed structural adjustments, and that Eleanor represented a complication to the inheritance structure that needed to be resolved. He said she'd be taken somewhere safe, that she'd have a good life, but that she couldn't remain part of the Kingsley family. He made it sound almost benevolent, like he was protecting her from some kind of family conflict. Did you believe that? Mark's laugh was bitter. I wanted to believe it. $50,000 was more money than I'd ever seen. My wife was sick, we had medical bills, I was drowning financially. So, yes, I told myself I was just taking money to look the other way on what was essentially a family custody dispute. He described how Daniel had hired Thomas Chen, a former security guard with a grudge against the Kingsleys, to actually carry out the kidnapping. Chen had inside knowledge of the estate, knew the routines, and was desperate enough for money to take the risk. The plan had been for Chen to take Eleanor during the birthday party, chaos hold her for a few weeks to make the kidnapping look legitimate, then turn her over to a contact who would place her in adoption through unofficial channels. That contact was my brother Robert. Chen brought the baby to him in July, told him it was a child who needed a home and the mother couldn't keep her. Robert thought it was a questionable adoption, maybe technically illegal, but he didn't know it was Eleanor Kingsley. He didn't figure that out until 6 months later, when he saw news coverage of the anniversary of the kidnapping. And when he did figure it out, he called me in a panic, wanted to know what to do. I told him if he went to the police, we'd both go to prison for kidnapping. His wife would go to prison. The baby would go into foster care. I convinced him that Eleanor was better off with them than back with a family that was so dysfunctional someone had paid to have her kidnapped in the first place. The prosecutor showed Mark the bank records Catherine had collected. Do you recognise this transaction? That's the $50,000 Daniel paid me. September 1994, after I'd successfully buried enough evidence to get the case downgraded from active to cold status. And this... The prosecutor showed him Thomas Chen's death certificate. Mark's face went pale. Chen got greedy, started demanding more money from Daniel, threatening to go to the police if he didn't get paid. I tried to warn him, told him Daniel was dangerous, that he needed to disappear and forget he'd ever been involved. But Chen didn't listen. A week after he sent that blackmail letter, he was dead. Do you have direct evidence that Daniel Kingsley murdered Thomas Chen? No, but I investigated the accident scene. The brake lines had been cut professionally, not enough to fail immediately, but enough to fail under stress. The same method was used on another person who'd crossed Daniel years later, a hotel employee who'd witnessed something suspicious. That was ruled accidental too. Mark looked directly at the camera. Daniel threatened to kill my entire family if I didn't cooperate, if I ever thought about coming forward. And based on what happened to Thomas Chen, based on what happened to anyone who got in his way, he wasn't bluffing. After Mark's testimony ended, I sat in that observation room for a long time watching him be led away by US Marshals. The prosecutors were already drafting arrest warrants for Daniel Kingsley, coordinating with Rhode Island authorities, building what they assured me was an airtight case. But all I could think about was what Mark had said about my adoptive father, that Robert hadn't known who I really was when he took me in, that he'd only discovered the truth months later when it was too late to undo without destroying everyone involved. I need to talk to them, I told Agent Webb. My parents, before Daniel gets arrested and this becomes a media circus. I need to hear it from them. Agent Webb understood without me having to explain further. Within 2 hours, Robert and Linda Hayes were brought to a FBI conference room under the pretense of additional questioning. They looked terrified, holding hands like condemned prisoners walking to execution. When they saw me sitting there with federal prosecutors and agents surrounding us, my father's face crumbled. "April," he whispered, "I am so sorry." The lead prosecutor activated the recording equipment. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, you've been advised of your rights and have declined to have an attorney present for this conversation. Is that correct?" They both nodded. Linda couldn't even look at me. "I want to hear it from you," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "All of it, the truth. Not the version you've been telling yourselves for 30 years to make it bearable, but what actually happened." My father took a shaky breath. "In July of 1994, a man named Thomas Chen contacted me. We'd known each other from my time working at the Kingsley Hotel. He was security, I was maintenance. He said he had a situation. A baby girl whose mother couldn't keep her looking for a good home. No agencies involved because the mother wanted privacy. He said it was unofficial adoption, that we'd have to do the paperwork ourselves, but that it was legal." He paused, wiping his eyes. "Your mother and I had been trying to have children for 8 years. We'd been through fertility treatments, miscarriages, adoption applications that went nowhere. When Chen brought you to us," his voice broke, "you were perfect. 18 months old, healthy, beautiful. We fell in love with you immediately." "You paid him $50,000, I said flatly. "I found the money in your garage. You never spent it because you knew it was wrong." "We paid him," Robert admitted. "And the moment the money left our hands, I knew something wasn't right. The adoption papers were too simple, too unofficial. Chen wouldn't answer direct questions about your mother or where you'd really come from. But you were already in our home, already sleeping in the nursery we'd prepared. We told ourselves we were saving you from something worse." Linda finally spoke, her voice raw with tears. "I couldn't have biological children. The doctors said it would never happen. You were a miracle to me, the answer to years of prayers." She looked at me directly for the first time. "When your father figured out who you really were when he saw the news coverage 6 months later and recognized your birthmark, your face, I begged him not to report it. I begged him to let us keep you. I knew it was selfish, I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't give you up." "You loved me," I said slowly. "But you loved me with so much guilt you couldn't show it properly." "Yes," Linda sobbed. "Every time I looked at you, I saw what we'd done. I saw a family somewhere who was grieving, who deserved to have you back. I loved you desperately, but that love was poisoned by guilt and fear, so I held back. I gave everything to Lily because loving her didn't hurt, didn't remind me of our crime. And I made you feel invisible because I couldn't bear to really see you without breaking down completely." I felt tears on my own face now. "You chose your fear over my right to know who I am. You let me grow up feeling inadequate, feeling unloved, believing there was something fundamentally wrong with me. And all along, you knew the truth, that I had a family who wanted me, who grieved for me, who never stopped looking. You stole 30 years from them and from me." "I know," my father said. "I know, and I've lived with that guilt every single day. But April, you need to understand something else. Daniel Kingsley is the most dangerous person in this story. He's the one who orchestrated everything, who paid Chen, who killed him, when he became a liability. Mark told me years ago that Daniel had threatened his family, that people who crossed him ended up dead in convenient accidents." "The FBI knows," I said. "They're arresting him." "Be very careful," Robert pleaded, gripping the table between us. "He's eliminated everyone who got in his way. Chen witnesses anyone who knew too much. And now you're exposing that everything he spent 3 decades covering up. He won't let that happen without a fight. The prosecutors spent the next 2 days reviewing evidence with a level of thoroughness that made me want to scream. They had Mark's testimony, Catherine's audio recording, the financial documents I'd analysed, Thomas Chen's suspicious death certificate, mountains of evidence that pointed to Daniel Kingsley as the architect of my kidnapping and subsequent cover-up. But every time I thought we were ready to move forward, another lawyer would raise another concern about admissibility or chain of custody or potential defence strategies. "We have enough for an arrest warrant," Agent Webb finally said during one particularly frustrating meeting. "But the defence team Daniel can afford will challenge every piece of evidence we have. Catherine's recording was made without his consent in a state that requires two-party notification for recordings. Mark's testimony comes from someone with a felony conviction who's testifying to reduce his sentence. The financial records show suspicious transactions, but don't explicitly prove kidnapping." "So, what do we need?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "A direct confession. If we can get Daniel to admit what he did in his own words, in a controlled setting, where the recording is legally obtained, that becomes nearly impossible for any defence attorney to overcome." "You want me to confront him? To wear a wire?" The room went silent. Agent Chen was the first to speak. "It's dangerous, April. Daniel has killed before when people threatened him. If he even suspects you're recording, if he feels cornered—" "I'll do it," I interrupted. "I need to do it. I need to look him in the eye and hear him admit what he took from me." For the next day, FBI technicians trained me on how to wear a concealed recording device, how to guide a conversation without appearing to lead or entrap, how to stay calm if Daniel became hostile. They ran through dozens of scenarios, teaching me to read body language that might indicate violence, showing me panic signals I could use if I felt unsafe. Agent Webb made me practice walking through the Kingsley estate layout, using floor plans identifying escape routes and safe spaces where agents could intervene quickly. But before I could go through with it, I needed to see Marianne. My biological mother deserved to know what I was planning, deserved a chance to object if she wanted to. I met her at a neutral location, a private room in a hotel in Providence, with FBI agents stationed nearby but out of sight. She embraced me the moment I walked in, holding me as though I might disappear again if she loosened her grip. "I've been so worried. Catherine told me about the threats about your car. I want you somewhere safe, somewhere he can't reach you." "Mom," I said, and it was the first time I'd called her that. "I need to tell you what I'm about to do." When I explained the plan that I would confront Daniel, try to get him to confess on tape, her face went white. "No, absolutely not. April, you can't. He's too dangerous. She broke off, pressing her hands to her face. "You don't understand what he's capable of." "Then tell me." She sat down heavily, suddenly looking much older than her 58 years. "In 1998, after Charles died, I started pushing for the investigation into your disappearance to be reopened. I'd never believed you were dead, and I thought with new technology, new investigative techniques, maybe there was hope. Daniel came to see me. He was very calm, very reasonable. He told me that reopening the case would only bring more pain, that it would destroy the family's reputation, that I needed to let you go." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. Then he said, "If I didn't stop, if I kept pushing the FBI and the media, I might have another tragic accident. He said losing a child was devastating, but losing your life would prevent even more suffering for everyone involved." I stared at her. "He threatened to kill you, his own sister. He's killed before April. He'll kill again. Please, don't give him a reason to hurt you. I just got you back. I can't lose you again." "You lost me for 30 years because of him," I said firmly, "because he valued money more than family, because he was willing to destroy lives to protect his inheritance. I need to make sure he pays for that. Not just for me, but for you, for all the years you spent grieving for Dad, who died believing I was gone forever." Marianne wept, but she understood. Before I left, she held my face in her hands and said, "You look like your father. You have his courage, his sense of right and wrong. He would be so proud of who you've become." Catherine was waiting at the FBI office when I returned, and when she saw my resolve, she pulled me aside. "Daniel threatened Marianne in 1998. He threatened me in 2009. He spent decades using fear and violence to keep his secrets buried. If you're really doing this, you need to know that he won't hesitate to hurt you if he feels cornered. I know. And you're doing it anyway. I'm doing it because someone has to. Because if I don't, he walks away and 30 years of crimes go unpunished. Because Thomas Chen deserves justice, and Marianne deserves peace, and every child who has ever stolen from their family deserves to know that monsters like Daniel don't win." The next morning, I put on the wire a sophisticated device so small it was virtually undetectable, disguised as a button on my blouse. Agent Webb drove me to Newport, while Agent Chen coordinated surveillance teams around the Kingsley estate. They'd confirmed Daniel was home alone in his private wing, with no plans to leave that day. I stood outside the massive iron gates, looking up at the mansion where I should have grown up, and took a deep breath. Agent Webb's voice came through my concealed earpiece. "We're here. We're watching. At any sign of danger, we come in. Say your safe word, and we breach immediately." I pushed the intercom button and waited for security to grant me access. As the gate swung open and I walked up the long driveway toward a confrontation 3 decades in the making, I whispered to myself and to the agents listening, "I'm ready. Let's end this." The estate butler led me through corridors I'd walked before, but this time, everything felt different. I wasn't visiting as the long-lost daughter returning to her family. I was walking into a trap. I'd set myself carrying evidence that would destroy the man I was about to face. Security cameras tracked my progress, the same cameras the FBI was now monitoring from their command van, parked 2 blocks away. Daniel Kingsley's private office was in the East Wing, a room I hadn't seen during my previous visits. The butler knocked once opened the door and announced me with formal courtesy that felt absurd given what was about to happen. "Miss Martinez to see you, sir." Daniel stood from behind a massive mahogany desk that probably cost more than my annual salary. At 62, he was still handsome in the way wealthy men often are well-groomed, expensively dressed with silver hair and the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. But his eyes were cold when they found mine calculating and dismissive. "So you're the little lost lamb," he said without offering to shake my hand. "Marianne's newest obsession. Do you really think you belong in this family? That a DNA test and some childhood photos make you one of us?" I forced myself to remain calm, to channel every bit of professional composure I'd cultivated over years of high-stakes business meetings. "I know exactly who I am. Eleanor Victoria Kingsley, taken from her family on June 15, 1994, when she was 18 months old. And I know who arranged it." Something flickered in his expression, surprise, that I was being so direct, perhaps, or recognition that this wasn't going to be the conversation he'd expected. "That's a very serious accusation. I hope you have evidence to support it, because defamation lawsuits can be quite expensive." "I have plenty of evidence," I said, pulling out my phone and opening the file of documents I'd prepared. "Bank records showing you transferred $200,000 to Thomas Chen in May 1994, 1 month before the kidnapping. Employment records showing Chen was fired from Kingsley Hotel Security and had detailed knowledge of the estate. Mark Hayes' sworn testimony that you hired him to sabotage the investigation." I watched Daniel's face tighten with each revelation, his confident smile fading into something harder and more dangerous. Mark Hayes is a convicted criminal testifying to reduce his sentence. Nothing he says has any credibility. And the financial records, the suspicious death of Thomas Chen exactly 1 week after he tried to blackmail you, the fact that you went from $3 million in debt to completely solvent within a year of Eleanor's disappearance. I kept my voice level professional, laying out facts like I was presenting a risk assessment report. "Your motive was clear. Eleanor's grandfather was revising his will to include all grandchildren equally. With her alive, your inheritance would be cut in half. With her gone, you'd have access to the fortune you needed to save yourself from bankruptcy. You can't prove any of that, Daniel said, but his voice had an edge now defensive rather than dismissive. Thomas Chen was a nobody who got greedy and tried to orchestrate a kidnapping on his own. An 18-month-old baby didn't deserve millions she'd never appreciate, couldn't possibly use. I saved this family's legacy from being diluted across too many heirs. The admission hung in the air between us. He'd just confessed to believing Eleanor didn't deserve her inheritance, to thinking the kidnapping served a legitimate purpose. I pressed forward carefully, afraid to break the momentum of his arrogance. So you admit you knew about the kidnapping, that you supported what happened to Eleanor? Supported. He laughed bitter and cold. I orchestrated it. Someone had to make the difficult decisions, while everyone else was too sentimental to see what needed to be done. Yes, I hired Chen. Yes, I paid him to remove Eleanor from the equation. And yes, I ensured the investigation went nowhere by bringing Mark Hayes into the arrangement. He leaned back against his desk, crossing his arms. But you can't prove I did anything illegal. Chen handled the actual crime. Hayes buried the evidence. I simply provided financial incentives for outcomes that benefited everyone, including killing Thomas Chen when he tried to blackmail you. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Careful, April. You're making very serious allegations. Am I? Chen died in a convenient accident right after demanding more money. Just like other people who got in your way over the years. That hotel employee who saw something suspicious. The security guard who had questions. All dead in accidents that were never properly investigated. That fool thought he could extort me, Daniel said, his composure finally cracking. Thought he could threaten a Kingsley and walk away with more money. I showed him what happens to people who cross me. Chen's death was unfortunate but necessary, just like anyone else who threatens what I've built. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it, but I kept my expression neutral. So you murdered him? I protected my interests. There's a difference. He pushed away from the desk, moving closer to me, and I saw real danger in his eyes now. You think you can walk in here with your little moral outrage and destroy me? You think the FBI will believe? He stopped mid-sentence, his gaze dropping to my blouse, to the button that wasn't quite like the others. His face went from angry to murderous in an instant. You little bitch, he snarled, lunging toward me. You're recording this. I stumbled backward, shouting my safe word, Marianne, Marianne. The office door exploded inward. Agent Webb came through, first weapon drawn, with Agent Chen and 4 other agents immediately behind her. FBI Daniel Kingsley, step back with your hands visible. Daniel froze his hand inches from my throat, his face twisted with rage and the dawning realization that everything he'd just said had been captured on tape. Agent Chen grabbed his arms, forcing them behind his back while reading him his rights. Daniel Kingsley, you're under arrest for kidnapping, murder conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and witness intimidation. You have the right to remain silent. As they led him away in handcuffs, Daniel looked back at me one last time. You'll never be a real Kingsley. You're still just that invisible little girl, desperate for anyone to notice you. I met his eyes without flinching. And you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison for what you did to that little girl. I call that justice. The media discovered the story within hours of Daniel's arrest. By evening, news vans surrounded the FBI field office in Boston, and by the next morning, my face was on every major news outlet in the country. Lost heiress found after 30 years competed with billionaire arrested for niece's kidnapping as the dominant headline. The story had everything the press loved: wealth, family, betrayal, a decades-old mystery solved, and a victim who'd survived against impossible odds. I watched the media circus from the safety of FBI protective custody, still processing what had happened in Daniel's office. Agent Webb had played the recording for me once, making sure it had captured everything clearly. Hearing Daniel's voice, admit to orchestrating my kidnapping, to murdering Thomas Chen, to threatening anyone who got in his way, It made the whole conspiracy undeniable. His arrogance had been his downfall. He'd been so confident in his power, so certain he was untouchable that he'd confess to everything rather than stay silent. The legal proceedings moved with surprising speed once prosecutors had Daniel's recorded confession. The federal grand jury indicted him on multiple charges within a week. I sat in the courtroom during his arraignment, watching him in an orange jumpsuit as the charges were read aloud. Count 1, kidnapping in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 1201, carrying a sentence of 20 years to life. Count 2, murder in the first degree in the death of Thomas Chen, carrying a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Count 3, conspiracy to obstruct justice, carrying a sentence of up to 10 years. Count 4, witness intimidation and threatening, carrying a sentence of up to 5 years. Count 5, attempted murder of April Martinez, also known as Eleanor Kingsley, carrying a sentence of 10 to 15 years. Daniel's attorney, an expensive defense lawyer from New York who specialized in white-collar crime, immediately requested bail. Your Honor, Mr. Kingsley has deep ties to this community, has never been charged with a crime before, and presents no flight risk. The federal prosecutor stood. Your Honor, the defendant has significant financial resources, properties in multiple countries, and has already demonstrated a pattern of eliminating witnesses who threaten him. He orchestrated the kidnapping of his own niece for financial gain and murdered at least one person to cover it up. He poses an extreme danger to the community and to the victim in this case, who he attempted to assault during the FBI's arrest. The government requests he be held without bail. The judge barely hesitated. Bail is denied. The defendant will remain in federal custody pending trial. Given the severity of the charges and the documented pattern of witness intimidation, this court finds Mr. Kingsley poses both a flight risk and a danger to the community. I watched Daniel's face as the reality sank in. He would be sitting in a cell until trial. No multi-million-dollar bail could save him. No powerful connections could make this disappear. For the first time in his life, his money couldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions. Mark Hayes' sentencing came next. In exchange for his cooperation and full testimony, prosecutors recommended reduced charges. He pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and accepting bribes with a total sentence of 3 years, most of which would be credited for time already served. He'd be out in 18 months with good behaviour. I watched him read his allocution, his voice shaking as he admitted to betraying his oath as a police officer and helping to cover up a child's kidnapping for money. I was drowning financially, and I made a choice that has haunted me every day for 30 years, he said, finally looking at me. I helped hide a baby from her family. I buried evidence. I let a murderer walk free. There's no excuse for what I did, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to atone for it. The most difficult sentencing was my adoptive parents. Robert pleaded guilty to concealing a felony and obstruction of justice. The prosecutors were initially seeking 8 to 10 years, but I'd written a letter to the judge requesting leniency, explaining the complex circumstances of how he'd come to have me, how he genuinely believed for months that it was a legal, if questionable, adoption. The judge sentenced him to 5 years reduced to 3, with 2 years of supervised release after citing his cooperation and my victim impact statement. Linda's involvement had been more peripheral. She hadn't been part of the initial conspiracy, only learnt the truth later, and chose to stay silent. She received a 3-year suspended sentence and 200 hours of community service. She'd avoid prison entirely if she completed her probation successfully. I watched my adoptive parents in court, seeing the weight of 30 years of guilt finally crushing them. Linda couldn't stop crying. Robert looked like he'd aged a decade in the weeks since his arrest. When the judge allowed them to address me directly, Robert's words were simple and devastating. We took everything from you, your family, your name, your childhood. We did it out of fear and selfishness, and there's no punishment severe enough for what we did. But I want you to know that despite everything, despite how wrong it all was, we did love you. We loved you so much we convinced ourselves our lies were protecting you. We were wrong. I'm so sorry. The final moment of that chapter came when Daniel was transferred from the courthouse back to federal detention. Media surrounded the transport vehicle, cameras flashing as he was led in these shackles. He saw me standing with Agent Webb on the courthouse steps, and even from that distance I could see the hatred in his eyes. He had nothing to lose now, so he shouted across the crowd, "You'll never be one of us. You're still that invisible little girl nobody wanted." I stood there surrounded by FBI agents and federal prosecutors, no longer invisible, no longer powerless. I looked directly at him and said loud enough for every reporter to hear, "You took 30 years from me. Now, justice takes the rest of your life." The media captured that moment, me standing tall, him in chains, the perfect image of victim turned victor. By the next day, that quote was everywhere, turned into hashtags and memes and symbols of survivors taking back their power. 3 days later, Mr. Whitmore, the Kingsley family attorney, requested an urgent meeting. I met him at his Providence office, accompanied by Agent Webb, who insisted on continuing security until Daniel's trial was complete. Whitmore looked uncomfortable as he pulled out a thick legal document. "April, or should I say, Eleanor, there's something urgent about your grandfather's estate, and will that you need to understand immediately. This changes everything about your inheritance and your legal position within the family." I asked Mr. Whitmore if we could postpone our discussion about the will for a few days. Money and inheritance felt secondary to everything else I was grappling with. The emotional weight of watching people who'd raised me go to prison, of knowing my biological uncle would spend his life behind bars, of carrying the knowledge that multiple people had been willing to lie, steal and kill to keep me hidden. I needed time to breathe, to process, to figure out who I was now that the truth was finally out. Marianne had been calling me every day since Daniel's arrest, wanting to see me to talk to build something that resembled a mother-daughter relationship. But I'd been putting her off, not ready to navigate that emotional minefield while everything else was still raw. Finally, a week after the sentencings, I agreed to visit her at the Kingsley estate. She was waiting for me in Eleanor's nursery, the room that had been preserved like a shrine for 30 years. When I walked in, she was sitting in the rocking chair by the window, the same chair she'd told me about, where she'd spent years singing lullabies to an empty room. She stood when she saw me, her hands twisting nervously, and I realised she was as uncertain about this as I was. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "I know I've been overwhelming you with calls and messages. I'm so afraid you'll disappear again if I don't hold on tight enough." "I'm not going anywhere," I assured her, though even as I said it, I wasn't entirely sure it was true. Part of me wanted to run from all of this, to go back to being April Martinez, with her simple life and uncomplicated identity. We sat together on the antique love seat that had once held baby Eleanor's stuffed animals. Marianne reached for my hand, and I let her take it, feeling the tremor in her fingers that suggested how much courage this conversation was taking. "I've waited 30 years to hold you again," she began, her voice breaking. "I've dreamed about this moment, imagined what it would be like, planned what I'd say to you. But now that you're here, I realise something I should have understood all along. You're not the baby I lost. You're not Eleanor, not really. You're April, a woman I don't know who's lived an entire life I wasn't part of. We're strangers who happen to share DNA." The honesty of it caught me off guard. I'd expected her to cling to the fantasy of reclaiming her lost daughter, to try to erase the 30 years between us with sheer force of maternal love. But instead, she was acknowledging the impossible distance between who I was and who she'd wanted me to be. "Can we learn to know each other?" she asked. And there was such vulnerability in the question that my own eyes filled with tears. "Can we build something real, even if it's not what either of us expected, even if it takes years?" "I want to try," I said honestly. But I need time, Mum. I need to figure out who I am now that I'm both April and Eleanor. I need to grieve for the childhood I should have had and make peace with the one I actually lived. I need to learn how to be your daughter when I don't have any memories of you, when every instinct I have is to protect myself from more hurt. She nodded, wiping her eyes. We'll go slow as you need. I promise not to push, not to expect more than you can give. I just want the chance to know you, to be part of your life, however you'll let me. Before leaving the Kingsley estate, I asked Marianne if I could spend some time alone in the nursery. She seemed to understand that I needed privacy to process everything, and she left me there surrounded by artifacts of a life I'd never lived. Baby clothes, I'd never worn toys, I'd never played with a crib. I had no memory of sleeping in. I found myself drawn to the antique writing desk in the corner, the one that looked like it had been there since the house was built. I opened the drawers and found old stationery, expensive paper with the Kingsley family crest embossed at the top. On impulse, I pulled out a sheet and began to write. Dear April. I started addressing the letter to my 12-year-old self, the age when the loneliness had felt most crushing, when I'd believed there was something fundamentally wrong with me that made me unlovable. There's so much I want to tell you about what's going to happen, about who you'll become and the truths you'll learn. But most importantly, I need you to know this. You're going to spend years wondering why you're never enough. You'll watch your sister get praised for mediocre achievements, while your actual accomplishments are dismissed. You'll buy thoughtful gifts that barely get acknowledged. You'll try so hard to earn love that should have been freely given, and you'll believe deep down in your core that the problem is you. The words poured out years of pain and confusion and self-doubt crystallizing into sentences. It's not because you're lacking. It's not because you failed to be good enough, smart enough, quiet enough, helpful enough. It's because they couldn't love you without drowning in guilt. Every time they looked at you, they saw their crime. And rather than face that truth, rather than do the right thing and return you to your real family, they chose to hold back their love. They created a distance that protected them from their own guilt, but left you feeling like you were fundamentally flawed. I wrote about the DNA test that would change everything, about learning I was someone else entirely, about discovering that my whole life had been built on lies. One day, you'll understand that your worth was never determined by whether they could see it. You were always valuable, always deserving of love and recognition and celebration. The flaw was never in you. It was in them, in their inability to face what they'd done. The letter grew longer as I wrote about forgiveness and healing, about learning that understanding someone's reasons doesn't mean accepting their behavior. You'll learn that forgiveness doesn't mean pretending the damage didn't happen. You can understand why they did what they did and still acknowledge that it was wrong, that it hurt you, that you deserved better. Healing isn't about forgetting or minimizing your pain. It's about refusing to let that pain define you. I wrote about the future I was still figuring out, about having two mothers, about building a relationship with a biological family that felt foreign, about carrying both the name April and the name Eleanor without fully belonging to either identity yet. The pain you're carrying right now can become purpose instead of poison. You'll use your story to help others, to ensure no other child waits 30 years to know who they really are. That 12-year-old girl who feels invisible and worthless is going to grow into a woman who brings down a killer, who testifies before federal prosecutors, who stands tall when the man who destroyed her family tries to diminish her one last time. I signed the letter, simply, with love, April Eleanor, age 32. I folded it carefully and placed it in the nursery drawer, tucking it beneath the baby blankets that had never been used. It felt like a ritual, a way of honouring both the child I had been and the child I should have been. April and Eleanor, two identities that would somehow have to learn to coexist in one body, one life. As I closed the drawer, I whispered to the empty room, to the ghost of baby Eleanor, who'd been taken from this place, to the memory of 12-year-old April, who'd felt so desperately alone. I'm ready to know what happens next. 3 days after I left that letter in Eleanor's nursery, I finally met with Mr. Whitmore in his Providence office to discuss the will. Marianne had offered to come with me, but I declined needing to face this part of my new reality on my own terms. Agent Webb no longer accompanied me everywhere with Daniel in custody, and the immediate threats neutralized, I was slowly reclaiming my independence. Mr. Whitmore's office was lined with law books and family portraits, the kind of old money legal practice that had probably served the Kingsleys for generations. He gestured me to a leather chair and pulled out a document so thick it required its own binder. "Your grandfather, William Kingsley, was a remarkably prescient man," he began. "When Eleanor disappeared in 1994, he refused to declare her legally dead. He insisted on including provisions in his will for the possibility of her return, even though most of the family thought he was being foolishly optimistic." He opened the binder to a marked section. In 2010, shortly before his death, William updated his will one final time. He was very specific about Eleanor's inheritance. Let me read you the exact language. "If my granddaughter, Eleanor Victoria Kingsley, is found alive and her identity confirmed through DNA testing or other incontrovertible evidence, before she reaches the age of 35, she shall receive 40% of the Kingsley family trust, including all assets, properties and controlling interest in Kingsley Hotels Corporation as originally intended before her disappearance." The numbers Mr. Whitmore showed me were staggering. The family trust, currently valued at approximately $60 million, included real estate holdings across the Northeast investment portfolios and majority shares in the Hotel Corporation. 40% of that meant I was looking at an inheritance of roughly $24 million, plus significant influence over a company I'd never worked for. "Some family members are contesting this," Mr. Whitmore admitted. "They argue that you were raised outside the family, that you have no knowledge of the business, that the provision should be voided given the unusual circumstances. But legally, they have no standing. Your grandfather's will is ironclad, and Marianne has made it very clear that she supports your full entitlement to Eleanor's inheritance." I sat there processing numbers that felt abstract and unreal. $24 million. It was more money than I could have earned in 3 lifetimes as a financial analyst. It represented security, freedom, power, everything I'd never had growing up in that modest house in Medford. But it also represented something else, the reason Daniel had been willing to kidnap a baby, to murder a man, to threaten his own family. This money had been worth more to him than my life, than my mother's grief, than any sense of morality or human decency. "I need time to think about this," I told Mr. Whitmore. "Can you schedule a formal will reading with the full family present? I want to make my decision public." 2 weeks later, I sat at the head of a long conference table in the Kingsley Estate's formal dining room, surrounded by relatives I barely knew. Marianne sat to my right, her hand resting supportively on my arm. Catherine was there, along with various cousins and second cousins who'd come out of the woodwork once the will's provisions became public knowledge. Mr. Whitmore formally read the relevant portions of the will and confirmed my legal right to the inheritance. Then he turned to me. "Miss Martinez, Ms. Kingsley, would you like to make a statement regarding your intentions?" I stood, feeling every eye in the room on me, and channeled the same composure I'd used when confronting Daniel. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about what this money represents. To my grandfather, it represented love and hope, his refusal to give up on finding me. To Daniel, it represented something worth killing for. To some of you, it probably represents an unwelcome complication in family finances." I could see some of the relatives shifting uncomfortably, confirming my suspicion that several of them resented my return, primarily for financial reasons. "I've decided to accept the inheritance because my grandfather intended it for me, and because refusing it would dishonor his memory. However, I'll be dividing it differently than you might expect." I pulled out the financial plan I'd spent days developing. "I'll be keeping approximately $12 million, which I'll invest conservatively to ensure my financial security and independence. The remaining $12 million will be used to establish the Eleanor Foundation." Murmurs rippled through the room. Marianne squeezed my hand, tears already forming in her eyes. The foundation will be dedicated to finding missing children, supporting families who are searching for lost loved ones, and helping survivors of family abduction, whether by strangers or relatives, rebuild their lives. We'll fund investigation costs, provide legal assistance, offer therapy services, and work to ensure that no other child has to wait 30 years to know who they really are. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of relatives who ranged from supportive to openly hostile. I can't get back my 30 lost years. I can't undo the damage done to my mother, to my adoptive family, to everyone affected by Daniel's crimes. But I can make sure that other families don't suffer the same way. I can turn this pain into purpose, this tragedy into hope. That's how I honour both Eleanor Kingsley, who was stolen from her family, and April Martinez, who grew up believing she wasn't worth loving. Marianne was openly crying now, and even Catherine had tears streaming down her face. But several of the other relatives looked like they wanted to object to argue about family obligations and responsible wealth management. Before anyone could speak, there was a knock at the door. Mr. Whitmore's assistant entered apologetically. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a reporter from the Providence Journal outside. She's asking if Ms. Martinez would be willing to answer a few questions about the foundation she's establishing." I glanced at Marianne, who nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead. Tell your story. Let people know what you're doing." The reporter was waiting in the estate's garden, a young woman with a recorder and genuine interest in her eyes, rather than the sensationalism I'd encountered from some media outlets. She asked intelligent questions about the foundation's mission, its funding, and its goals. Then she asked the question that would define everything that came next. "You've become a symbol for many women who feel overlooked and undervalued in their own families. What message do you have for other women who feel invisible, who've spent years believing they weren't enough?" I thought about 12-year-old April, about the letter I'd written to her, about all the years of silently accepting that I didn't matter. And I thought about the voice I'd finally found, the power I'd claimed, the justice I'd helped achieve. Your value isn't determined by whether your family can see it. You don't have to earn the right to be loved or respected or celebrated. If the people around you make you feel invisible, that's their failure, not yours. Speak your truth, even when your voice shakes. Seek justice even when powerful people try to silence you. And remember that healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means refusing to let pain define you. Turn it into purpose instead. That interview quote became the foundation's mission statement. Within days, it was shared thousands of times, quoted by advocacy groups working with abuse survivors and displaced children. The Eleanor Foundation officially launched 3 months later, and I discovered that running a nonprofit dedicated to finding missing children was the most meaningful work I'd ever done. 6 months after that garden interview, I sat in the Foundation's modest Boston office, reviewing case files. We'd already reunited 3 children with their families, a teenager hidden by a non-custodial parent, a toddler abducted during a divorce, and an infant stolen from a hospital 20 years ago. Each reunion reminded me that my story had ended better than most. Every Sunday, I drove to Newport for tea with Marianne. She'd tell me stories about my father building a picture of the parent I'd never known. "Charles never stopped hoping you'd come home," she told me one afternoon. "He kept your room exactly as it was. Every year, on your birthday, he'd sit there and talk to you wherever you were. He died in 2001, and I believe it was a broken heart." My relationship with Linda was more complicated. She'd aged visibly from guilt and stress living in a small apartment after selling the Medford house. "Thank you for not hating me," she whispered during my last visit. "I can't forget," I told her honestly. "But I've learned to live with the past. Understanding why you did what you did doesn't mean I accept it, but it also doesn't mean I have to carry hatred forever." The biggest surprise was Lily. She'd volunteered at the foundation for months, approaching unglamorous work with unexpected dedication. "You taught me that family isn't about DNA or obligation," she told me one evening. "It's about choosing to show up and do the work. I want to be the sister you deserved all along." On a rainy Thursday afternoon, my assistant brought me a letter addressed personally to me. The envelope was thin and worn, the handwriting shaky. "Dear Ms. Martinez, my name is Rachel Chen. My daughter, Sophie, disappeared 5 years ago when she was 13. The police stopped looking. Everyone told me to give up hope, but I saw your interview, and I heard you say you waited 30 years. If you could survive that and still come home, and maybe Sophie can too. Please, can you help me find my daughter?" I sat holding that letter, feeling the weight of a mother's desperate hope, thinking about Marianne, sitting in an empty nursery for a decade, about all the parents who never got their children back. I opened my laptop and began typing. "Dear Mrs. Chen, yes, we can help. Tell me everything about Sophie." As I worked, I glanced at the photos on my desk, Marianne and me from last Sunday Lily, at our fundraiser Linda that I'd kept despite everything. And in the centre, baby Eleanor in her father's arms, both laughing at something outside the frame. I'd spent 32 years as April Martinez, the invisible daughter. I was learning to be Eleanor Kingsley, the returned heiress. But mostly I was becoming something entirely my own, a person who'd survived impossible circumstances and chosen to transform that survival into purpose. Rachel Chen's daughter was out there somewhere, and I was going to help bring her home. And that's where April's story reaches its most powerful chapter, not an ending, but a beginning. She transformed 30 years of pain, betrayal, and feeling invisible into a mission that's changing lives every single day. The invisible daughter became impossible to ignore, not through revenge or bitterness, but through purpose and healing. Think about what April accomplished. She brought down a murderer who'd been protected by wealth and power for 3 decades. She exposed a conspiracy that involved corrupt police, desperate adoptive parents, and a family member willing to kill for money. But more importantly, she chose forgiveness without forgetting understanding, without excusing and healing, without pretending the damage never happened. Daniel Kingsley is currently awaiting trial in federal prison, facing life without parole. Mark Hayes is serving his reduced sentence. Robert Hayes is in prison for 3 years, while Linda received probation. And April, she's building something that ensures no other child waits 30 years to know who they really are. The Eleanor Foundation has already reunited 3 families in just 6 months, and they're working on dozens more cases. Every time April helps find a missing child, she honours both the girl she was, April Martinez, who spent her childhood feeling worthless, and the girl she should have been, Eleanor Kingsley, who deserved to grow up knowing she was loved and wanted. Her story resonates with so many people because it speaks to a universal truth. Your worth isn't determined by how others treat you. Whether you've felt invisible in your own family, overlooked at work, or dismissed by people who should have valued you, April's journey reminds us that the problem was never you. It was their inability to see your value, their failure to give you what you deserved. What did you think of April's incredible journey? Did her decision to split her inheritance between personal security and the foundation surprise you? Do you think she made the right choice in maintaining relationships with both her biological mother and her adoptive mother? And what about Daniel Kingsley's arrogance? Can you believe he actually confessed everything because his ego wouldn't let him stay silent? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing your perspectives on these complex family dynamics. If this story moved you, if it made you think about justice, healing, and the power of turning pain into purpose, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We share stories like this every week, real stories about people who refused to stay victims, who fought for truth even when it was dangerous, and who found ways to heal even from the deepest wounds. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful narratives to light. And remember April's words, Your value isn't determined by whether your family can see it. Speak your truth even when your voice shakes. Turn your pain into purpose. Because you matter, you always have, and you always will. Thank you for listening to April's story. I'll see you in the next one.